Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. This episode was recorded on Sunday, September 22nd, 2019, starting at 2:21 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, and this is the 225th episode of the show. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with astrologers Helena Avelar and Luís Ribeiro about their new book on traditional astrology. For more information about how to subscribe to the podcast and help support the production of future episodes by becoming a patron, please visit theastrologypodcast.com/subscribe. Hi, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us. It's glad
Yeah,
to be here.
it's good to talk to you. I've corresponded with both of you for many years now, for over a decade, but I think this is the first time I've talked to you in person over Zoom.
Well,
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah. All right. So you both, I guess in order to introduce this episode, I should say that you're both actually the authors of one of my favorite introductory books on astrology, where I have a list of books that's like my top 6 beginner astrology books. And your book from 2010 is on that list as one of the best books that I recommend to beginners, titled On the Heavenly Spheres, a Treatise on Traditional Astrology. So this was published by the AFA in 2010. And when did you originally write this book?
2007.
Yeah, that
if I'm
was
not mistaken.
Yeah, the Portuguese publication came out in 2007. It took us about 3 years to write it. So
2004.
2004, 2005. That's
Originally, it was to be a very small book.
yeah.
Okay.
And it grew and it grew and
I'm familiar with that process of how that happens. So where are you both from?
I'm from Lisbon.
And I'm from Setúbal, which is a few kilometers south of Lisbon, so around the area. Yeah.
Okay. And how old are both of you roughly?
I'm 55.
I'm 45.
Okay. And how long have you both been studying astrology and then practicing it?
Do you want to start?
Oh.
You mean together or individually?
Let's start
together.
individually and then talk about how you started doing it together.
Mm-hmm. So I've been doing since I'm 17, so quite some time ago. Yeah,
quite some time. Okay.
Well, I began studying astrology seriously in '92. I would say. Before that, I had read books, all the books I could get my hands into. And I was aware of astrology, I think, all my life. Not only the sun sign astrology, I was always looking for something more serious. So I think I never discovered astrology. It was always something that I was aware of.
Okay. And when did you both start getting into traditional astrology? Because you started with modern astrology, I assume, right?
Yes.
And were you largely reading books that were written in Portuguese, or were you reading books that were written in other languages as well?
Well, both, I would say.
Both. We had a lot of stuff were in English at the time. Some were translated into Portuguese, some were not. A couple of things in French, Spanish, I think. We began studying tradition sometime around 2002, 2003.
Yeah.
We slowly began to gain interest in the tradition. We had some books on tradition that were translated into Spanish.
Castilian, yes.
Yeah, 50s, 60s. So they began the translation process quite early. And we started by that, and then we took Zoller's course.
Yes.
The beginner's course, and that started to open up, and we decided to move further into astrology, and we got to a point where we simply transitioned to traditional astrology. And just stopped
we also
thinking modern-wise, I think.
Yes, it was. We also studied with Sue Ward.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Sue Ward, and she's one of the primary practitioners of Renaissance astrology and specializes in the work of William Lilly, right?
Yes. He's one of the the best, I think, specialists in the practice of William Lilly, because she's quite good.
Yes. And that was what, like 2001, perhaps?
2002, yeah. Somewhere around that time, yeah.
Okay.
She
And by
visited
this
us
time,
here.
you're both already practicing astrology and already teaching this subject, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we are together since 1999, but we were both practicing astrology before. So, yeah, we were for a long time. We began with contemporary astrology. We call it contemporary astrology
Okay.
because we are both historians. And for us, when we say modern, means like 16th century. So
Right. Yeah, the idea of like
really.
the early modern period versus the modern period.
We call it contemporary, but you call it modern, and it's the same.
Sure.
We began with contemporary, and then I would say like 2001, and
I think the big shift was in 2004 when we renamed the school. The school wasn't called Academy. It had another name. And then when we transitioned to a traditional course and teaching traditional astrology, then we shifted to the Academy of Astrology. And that was the mark that made the shift. That was sometime in the beginning of 2004, if I remember correctly.
yes.
Okay.
And then we decide to go, as we say as a joke, to be born again traditionalists.
Okay. And then I remember by the late 2000s, you both you were very active, and you had launched a few different websites, it seemed like, for traditional astrology, including the Tradition Journal, which was a journal for predictive traditional astrology that you did 4 volumes of, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, it was a very good experiment, and if we could, we would have continued, but simply we had no more time.
Yeah,
That is
the thing was that it got extremely time consuming. Journals are always very complicated. Then managing all the collaborations, doing all the revisions. We had a team of people doing that, but it got too much, and it's difficult. And then by that time, we started again to engage in our academic studies, and the academic studies start consuming a lot of your time. So we decided to stop it while it was in its height.
Yes.
So not
Sure.
to let it fall too much.
It's always a very time-consuming. Yeah, it's always very time-consuming to edit a journal, but it was really good, and I think a lot of people would appreciate it now, 10 years later, where traditional astrology has become so much more popular. So I'll definitely put some links to it on the description page for this episode, and then eventually you're going to be reposting it on your website in the next few months. So I'll put links to it there when that's available as well, just for listeners
Yes.
who are not familiar with it.
One of the good things of the traditional journal was the people who cooperated with us, like you. They wrote very good articles, and I think that was very new then in 2010. So I think for now it will be very nice for people to read it if they want.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's still unique. It still stands out even today. I was just looking at it and surprised that it was from 2008 and 2009, but the
Yes.
quality of the articles as well as the design and layout still stands out as being, above and beyond what most astrology journals look like. So
Oh,
I'm
thank
sure
you.
people will really enjoy that. So you were publishing that in like 2008, 2009, and then your book came out in 2010. And that was actually
Yes.
translated into English by a friend of mine, Maria Mateus, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And she also translated the new book.
Yeah,
Maria
and she's
also translated the new book.
was
Actually,
excellent.
she is in the ideal position because she's Portuguese. She speaks English as her primary language, and she's an astrologer. So she's the ideal person to translate.
yeah, and she's a really brilliant astrologer that knows a lot about traditional astrology, and I think she's also a
Yes.
graduate of Kepler College, so she has a great background in the
Yes, she is.
history and everything else. So, but after that, you guys were very active. It especially seemed like in the English-speaking astrological community, but then it seemed like you kind of disappeared for several years, or you just weren't as active. And it seems like you decided to, at one point, go in a different direction and focus more on academic studies, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
What motivated that?
We decided at one point that we wanted to do, very primary research. So we wanted to do really serious research and structured research, and we thought that the academic environment would be ideal for that. Helena took history
Yes.
as her primary academic area. I came from geology and chemistry, which is completely outside of this, but then I took also history, art history, and then we followed through to master's degree and now the PhD. So we're trying to do as much as we can for really good focused research on astrological practices in terms of historical research, so we can have good sources and academic evaluated sources and analysis on astrological practices, because I think that's very important to organize the knowledge that we have and try to create new knowledge that might be useful in terms of understanding astrology.
Sorry, we also wanted to came out from the I would call it the opinion level and go into the research level. And as you can imagine, it was not easy to enter the academic environment, but we were very, very lucky because we are both now we are both researchers in history of science, and we found some people with an open mind. So I think we were very lucky because we could have been just barred and not allowed to pursue academically, but instead we were actually very supported.
Yeah.
So
there is a growing community of scholars that is interested in really knowing what was the function of astrology historically, and in many periods we have been focusing on medieval and early modern periods, but you can go do that analysis almost in any period of history. And there is this growing interest in knowing what exactly was the function of astrology in history, and in our case, in history of science. What was the participation? What level of participation did astrology have in the whole process of knowledge building? And that's basically the area where we're working now.
Yes, when I began my MA in 2010, I think, it was difficult to explain what I wanted. What I did was a very simple thing, was to research what we had in medieval Portugal, astrologically speaking, and try to analyze what they have. And my supervisor then, she was a bit hesitant, I would say. She was a bit worried about this, but as soon as she saw the draft of my work, she understood what I wanted. And she's an historian and she comes from a different area, but she understood what I want. And she said, look, this is great. Let's do it. And also I had a second supervisor. I think you know him. He's a German scholar, Kokur von Stuckrad. You know Kokur von Stuckrad? He was my second supervisor.
He wrote some major scholarship on the history of astrology, and I'm familiar with his work.
He was my second supervisor, so I was really lucky to have these two people, one Portuguese supervisor, very good, and also Koku. So my MA went well, and then I decided to move on to a PhD, and I applied for a grant. And again, I was very lucky because I got Professor Charles Burnett as a supervisor.
Wow.
which
who's
is
one of the
really
leading, Burnett's one of the leading scholars on medieval astrology. He's actually the leading scholar on medieval astrology probably in the world today. And
yeah,
just recently published a huge translation and critical edition of the work of Abu Mashar.
which is
Which
here.
we have it here somewhere.
Yeah. Which I'm reading through right now and finding some really amazing stuff actually. So that's really
Yes.
exciting.
And also not only a good scholar, but an exceptionally good supervisor. So I was very lucky.
Okay. So yeah, I
And
mean that's really
it's also Luís supervisor.
Is my co-supervisor. Also,
okay. And so both of that's happening then. Are you both you did your degrees at the Warburg Institute?
Yes.
And so what is the Warburg Institute for those not familiar with it?
Well, the Warburg Institute is a part of the University of London.
Okay.
And it is like it was also part of the work of Abby Warburg, a German scholar and researcher who moved into London in before or
30s,
during
I
the
think.
Second World War.
Before the Second World
Before, I think, yes. And he researched everything that's related to symbolism, magic, esotericism, astrology, mainly through the history of art history, but also history. I'm a student of history and I'm an historian, so I think it was the ideal place for me. And so when I got there, I thought like, well, I'm very lucky to be here because it's like, first of all, we have people from all different countries, not only English people, because that's in London, but from different countries. And the environment, the way that we relate to supervisors or to other students, it's really, really good. So we feel at home all the time, and we have access to an amazing library. And I mean amazing library. That's one of the things that I really miss here in Lisbon.
You have shelves and corridors of shelves only dealing with history of astrology.
Yes.
So every critical edition, every little obscure article that you can imagine, it's probably there. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, I visited once in 2008, and I'm pretty sure that has to be the best library just in the world for astrology books, and especially for traditional and older astrology books and critical editions and things of that nature.
Yes. And the way it is organized, you don't need to ask the book to a librarian. If you are a student of the Institute, you can just go there to the shelf and see, and they are organized by topic, not in alphabetic order. So you go there to pick one book and you end up with 500 books because they are all related. So it is organized in a way that you can make the best of the library, make the best of your study because of this. So it's really amazing. If you have the opportunity to go there, I would advise you to go because it's an amazing place.
And you just finished before we get to your PhD dissertations, so that's really important because it seemed like for most of the past century, in the early part of the century, suddenly there was academic interest in the history of astrology, and there was a growing but relatively small group of academics who were doing important work, making critical editions and doing projects like the CCAG to catalog all of the surviving Greek manuscripts on astrology.
David Just. You mean the work of David Just?
No, the earlier ones.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
More like Franz Cumont and some of those people in like the early 20th century, where there was growing academic interest in the history of astrology. And then eventually, later in the century, astrologers started getting interested in traditional astrology, but they were kind of like separate groups for a long time that didn't intersect. But more recently, over the past 2 decades, there have been individual astrologers who have been making an effort to go back to school and get advanced degrees, especially in the history of astrology or the history of science, in order to sort of merge those two worlds or merge that gap between the two groups.
Yes. For instance, in the Warburg Institute, we have Dorian Greenbaum.
also formed there. Yeah.
Dorian was one of the first, I think, and I always say that she broke the ice for us, because she was one of the first scholars to openly study astrology at this level. So I think you interviewed Dorian some time ago.
Yeah, she appeared on the podcast just a couple of years ago. And so she was another person who, like you, she was an astrologer. And I think she had like a bachelor's or a master's degree in Egyptology, but then became an astrologer. And she did a translation of Paulus Alexandrinus in, I think, 2001. But then eventually in the early 2000s decided to go back to school and get her PhD. And she went to the Warburg Institute, where I think Charles Burnett was also her advisor.
Yes.
And she ended up doing a dissertation on the daimon in Hellenistic astrology.
Yes.
So she was really inspiring to you, and seeing what she was able to do as part of maybe what motivated you guys to make that such a big move yourselves.
Yes, not only she was inspiring, but she was actively supportive, because we know her personally, and she was very, very supportive of both of us.
Yeah. And it is important that we have the study of history with astrology, because in speaking from an astrological perspective, it's like you were saying, there were many groups, and there still are to a certain degree, because you have pockets, let's say, pockets of people who studied specific works, specific authors, and are sort of less orbiting those authors and those lines of approach to astrology. While we, in our experience, although of course you always go to a certain technique or practice or author that you prefer, that's not almost natural, but one thing that lacks is to have a complete view of astrology, a view of the tradition, so that we can see how it evolves, how it develops, and we can extract the basic concepts, instead of having a basket full of contradictions, because people sometimes discuss a lot of the contradictions in astrology and they forget to see what everyone talks about, and it's common to everyone, and it's that fine line where you have the column of astrology with the consistent tradition, the consistent doctrine of astrology throughout times. That's where we should focus, not so much in the little differences.
Sure. And it seems like this study of history and culture kind of go hand in hand with the revival of traditional astrology, because in modern or contemporary astrology, you just study the techniques and you don't really need a lot of contextualization, because it's written in the same period that we're living in now. So there's just things you can take for granted that everybody knows or accepts. But as soon as you start going back into history, you have to understand like the culture and the time period and everything else. And so it seems like that's part of what you felt like you needed to specialize in more, or wanted to become more authorities to talk about, is just that process of understanding the history and the context in which the techniques emerged or were practiced.
Yeah, I think what we value is what we call astrological culture, because contemporary people, and most contemporary people, I don't know what they do, I don't know all of them, but most contemporary people would just focus, as you said, in the practice. And they don't worry about the way the technique evolved or the way the technique was created. So what happens is that opens the space for all sorts of opinions. If you don't know how the technique is generated, if you don't know the rationale of a technique, you might have your own opinion, or you say, oh, because in my own horoscope it works. That's the main argument. Sure. It works for me. Right. And so this would generate all sorts of what we might call personal astrology. For me, it works. So if you know where the technique comes from, if you have this context, all the context, if you understand the idea, you will you will be able to criticize, in the good sense of the word. You will be able to criticize and say, this, I think it makes sense. This, I don't think it makes sense, because it's not rooted in the tradition. That is the main thing. And also because, probably because I'm an historian, but I think it's very important for any kind of practice to understand how it developed. Otherwise, you have no root. You just live in the superficial level.
Say things without any substance.
Yes.
Well, we're living in a world where people say things without any substance anyway. It seems to be a common thread.
It seems like that's what's drawn a lot of people to traditional astrology over the past decade is wanting to go past, oftentimes like doing modern astrology, but hitting a wall in terms of your understanding of the subject, and realizing that if you wanted to go deeper into it and wanted to be able to actually synthesize charts or know the reason why you're saying certain things, that at a certain point you have to go back into the tradition in order to figure some of those things out.
Yes. I think what happened, and I'm talking a bit historically here also, but in the 20th century, we had a slow move from the tradition, and a natural escape from the tradition because of the whole cultural movement of the 20th century. And we got to a point where things get to a level of abstraction which had no connection to reality. So we have a lot of astrological practices nowadays that don't have any connection to reality, and sometimes not any connection to astrology itself. Yep. So most of the time we see people say they're astrologers and they've studied astrology, but they explain astrology through several other systems, esoteric, psychological, several, spiritual or something else, or scientifically even, and they don't explain astrology by itself. And any form of knowledge, such as astrology, must be able to explain itself. It must have an internal rule which we can fall upon when we have a doubt. Or else we can't. It's like mathematics, comparing. It's an easy comparison to do. If you have a doubt, you go for the mathematical rule. You go for the geometrical rule. That will give you the answer if you're progressing correctly or you're not. And astrology lacked that for a long time. Now it's recovering that. And we're starting to see a nucleus, a hard core nucleus of astrology, of the doctrine that's coming out again, which was completely lost until we started to have translations. And we're here speaking in English, so in the English-speaking community, there weren't many translations of the old texts until 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago. So they were unknown, and now you have it, and now you had already enough time for that information to mature and to result in a community, let's say, of people that are practicing traditional astrology and have a common language already ground up, which is not William Lilly, it's not Hellenistic, it's not medieval. There's already a nucleus which is common to any tradition in astrology, and that's where things need to be worked upon. It's to understand exactly what the nucleus is composed of. Although we can have, of course, certain techniques that exist in different cultures, in different epochs, that's natural. But still, there is a common ground to all the essential dignities, the qualities of the planets. All of that is the nucleus, and we can see it in any astrology book, any astrology primer will have to have those principles, which are absolutely lacking in most of the things that were written in the 20th century. You don't have a common ground. You don't have an explanation for the meanings of the planets. You don't have an explanation for the aspects.
Or you have an explanation that is outside astrology, like psychology, for instance.
I call it numerology, symbology, mythology. For example, one of my main glitches with the rationale of astrology sometimes in present days is mythology. You fall back into mythology to justify why a planet works in a certain way. But we're forgetting that mythology was forged from the observation of the planets. So we're doing things incorrectly.
Backwards.
Yeah, it's not the mythological god that gives the planet a certain quality. That the quality of that god was derived from the observation of the planet's actions in nature. So we're doing it incorrectly. You cannot do it, the process, inversely. So it gets complicated.
Right. And there was also the presumption that that's the way it's always been done. And that assumption was projected back into the tradition that mythology has always been the primary interpretive principle for understanding celestial bodies. And therefore, it's getting projected forward into the discovery of new ones. So that's the primary way that they're approaching like new bodies, is by thinking about the name and the mythology or other things associated with it, instead of observing it astrologically and seeing what it correlates with in practice.
Yes.
That's been the problem with the new planets, the modern planets, since their beginning. We didn't have any, for once, we don't have any rules for new celestial bodies. The corpus of astrology has very little. There are some, but and that is something that has to be studied more carefully.
Yes.
But you don't have a way, a method, let's say, of interpreting new celestial bodies, because for millennia, the celestial, the skies were supposed to be immutable and perfect, so you wouldn't have change in the heavens. When you got to the early modern period, and I'm talking about this because it's exactly the area where I'm studying currently, you have a lot of changes. You have the supernovas. You have a lot of things popping up that need to be explained, and there's no techniques to explain them. But you still see the astrologers trying to somehow incorporate all of that. Unfortunately, when you get to the new planets, as you very well know, astrology was already almost dead in terms of tradition. So we didn't have a proper digestion, the proper background and proper digestion of what the new planets could mean in terms of astrology. So, and we still don't. But this is my point of view. People might think differently, but we still don't. We still assume a lot of things. A lot of characteristics we project into the new planets.
And there's another thing. That,
it's supposed, it's assumed, but like mythology, and there are other points. Sorry.
No, that's right. And there's another thing, that astrology is, for us at least, the way that humanity, looks at the universe. That's why it's geocentric. It's not because we don't know that the sun is in the center. It's because we look at the universe from this window, from Earth. And also we look at the universe with our own instruments. So when we look at there, outside, we see Jupiter, Saturn, and then we don't see Uranus, Neptunus, and Pluto. Right. So if we think of astrology as the way humanity looks at the universe, the way that we absorb the universe, we wouldn't need the new planets. I know lots of people don't agree, and I'm not trying to push this idea, but this is our view.
Yes,
so
if you find ourselves without any instrumentation, you don't have a table, you don't have anything else, you still look at the sky and try to build up a basic chart.
Actually, something that we do with our students.
Yeah,
we take them outside and say, look, imagine that the baby is just born. What is the chart? And they are like, can I look at my iPhone? No, you cannot. Just look at the universe. And they begin looking at the universe, and they think, and they end up calculating the ascendant and the planets, because they can see some of them, or they remember where they are, and they can calculate a chart without any instrument. That is one of the things. Of course, it's not an exact chart. It's just a calculation,
of course. And you can't do that with the new planets. So that places a problem. This is a nuclear problem into astrology. How do you incorporate such a thing? And I think it hasn't been thought out completely, because people are too stuck to the practice. And for us, it was difficult when we transitioned to tradition to leave the new planets alone.
We have to divorce the new planets.
Exactly. There's a whole process of mourning there. But what happened is, as we moved into a traditional interpretation, we still had new planets there in the chart, and suddenly we weren't using them. And we look at it, we talk and we said, well, let's take them out and see what happens. And
let them go.
They've never returned since. But that doesn't mean that they don't need to be integrated into astrology, but that needs to be done astrologically, and that takes time. I think that will take centuries.
And also, when we look at contemporary astrology or modern astrology, most of the readings begin with the new planets. And if we are really honest, some of the modern astrologers, they don't really know how to interpret without the new planets. They always focus on the new planets. If you take them the new planets, it's like if you take them a leg and then you want them to walk, they cannot. So even when we have students who have already studied contemporary astrology, we say okay, it is difficult to learn something the second time because you already know astrology in a certain way. So now you have to take all these things that you know, just put them in a mental box and just let them be there. And then you have to begin. And they always think like, oh, I have to go back again and study what I already know. But they found out very soon that it's not a repetition. It's not what they know. It's
a completely different way of thinking.
Exactly. Yeah. It's starting from the beginning. And then I say, if you want to incorporate the new planets, that is fine. But first, learn astrology. First, you learn astrology. You learn the idea of astrology, the symmetry of the astrological system. You learn the way it works. And then if you need the new planets, that's fine. Just use them. And when they really learn astrology, they don't need the new planet. And they have to make this kind of mourning for the new planets. And that's fine. We have nothing against that. And we would love to. Actually, we would love to have people studying the new planets with a really serious astrological basis. That would be lovely. Not just because it works in their own charts, not just because they read in some magazine, but really a very scientific study of the new planets.
Within the astrological community.
Without the psychology, without Jung, without all those things, astrologically speaking.
For that to work, I think we would need to first clean up all that we assume that the planets do, and then arrange a method that could study them with astrological rules.
One of the things you've recovered, one of the things that's clear is that in traditional astrology, the perspective of the observer matters and is a major component. And that's something that was a huge part of traditional astrology in a number of different techniques, but it kind of fell out of modern astrology as it assumed almost like a universal sort of view that the perspective of the observer isn't relevant or wasn't paid attention to as much. But that almost seems like a philosophical or conceptual premise that's important.
Yes. There are two main ideas. One is that astrology is the language of some humanity looking at the universe. So yes. And the other is that astrology reflects nature. So nature, it would be the first guide. If it doesn't make sense, if it's not natural, we have to think about it. We have to rethink about that. And this would bring us to another thing that is one of the things that Luís has worked a lot, which is the way of teaching astrology. I think you might, because we learn astrology, contemporary astrology, in a certain way, and we teach traditional astrology in a completely different way.
Yeah, and I've been trying to research how astrology is taught, which is something we still don't know today. So if we go back in time, how do they teach astrology? What's an astrological curriculum for a university in the Middle Ages or in the early modern period? What do they do? That answer hasn't been reached yet. But what you can see is that there is an important integration of astrology, not only with itself, but with the philosophical system where things are explained. And that's quite important. Of course, philosophical systems as Aristotelianism have fallen out for centuries, but we still use the basic premises of Aristotle's system to explain the astrological conditions. We still do that today, because their way of interpreting the nature and the universe. It's not that they are updated. Of course, we know that matter is not constituted by the four elements, but still the four elements represent certain characteristics which we can use to describe certain natural effects. So that's still valid to a certain point. We might update it, but it's still there.
So this is what we begin teaching astrology by the elements.
Yeah, well, the book, which was an attempt for us to write something which was, if someone has never heard about astrology, how would you explain it to it?
Without anything else.
And in terms of structure, I may say we started with the aspects, and the first chapter to pop up, I think, was the more complex interactions of the aspects. Obsession and all of that. And the last bit we wrote was exactly the introduction and the first basis. How do you start to explain astrology? And that's nature, really. That needs to be our guide. And all the natural principles. Sometimes people go for the mysticism and for the magical part and the spiritual part, and forget that all of that comes from the natural cycles that we experience in this earth and this daily life every time. And that's the key for understanding astrology.
Because people speak of astrology or magic as if they are separate things from life, but they are actually part of life.
There's one question that we always ask our students, which is, why do we have 12 signs of the zodiac? Well, there are a lot of people practicing astrology that don't know this without getting into a very numerological or symbolic nature, which is correct, of course, and you have a symbolism there. But you have 12 because you have, in the course of a year, so a cycle of seasons, you would have 12 lunations, so 12 stations of the moon and the sun, which will give you a basic division of 12. And it's because you have that basic division of 12 in the lunar cycle that 12 becomes endowed with a certain meaning of completion and of cycle. And then you have the 2 and the 7, and the 7 comes from the planets. And all the symbolism starts to derive from the structure of the universe as itself, and astrology is the basis there. And this is something people sometimes don't understand, which is astrology is the mother of all sciences in a certain aspect. And here we would say astronomy / astrology, because we're talking about the same kind of knowledge at this period, which is you're seeing everything moving around you and you're trying to interpret it and you're trying to extract meaning from that. And that's the basic of astrology, numerology, mysticism, and all of that comes from the experience that we as human beings have of nature. So that's quite important.
And that takes us to another thing, that astrology was, for us, we think, and this is something that we talk a lot of times, astrology was not invented. I mean, there was not a moment where people were looking at the sky and saying, I'm going to call this Capricorn and I'm going to call that something. Astrology was probably a part of human development. And I mean, like, since the beginning, because you can see that the concept of correlation, the correlation between the movements of the planets and the cycles of the moon and all the things, and the correlation of these things with the events on Earth, this concept, which is actually the basis of astrology, it is always present in humanity, And I would say I would dare to say that it's also present in some animals, like the birds that use the constellations to fly to other places, and all the animals that regulate their cycles by the moon. So in a very, very basic system, we all
instinctive, I would say, in an
Instinctive.
instinctive level, astrology is there.
It is
biologically
there in a very simple
engraved,
way.
yeah.
Yes.
But,
And
but
then
as historians,
as
you still recognize that some techniques were introduced at different stages, or that there was some variation in the tradition.
Yes, of course. And I'm not talking about horoscopic astrology or anything like that. Of course,
Okay.
I'm talking about the basic correlation between planetary movements and events on Earth. A very, very basic level. So as humanity developed, we began to make it more complex until we get to the completely intellectual understanding of astrology that involves techniques and all sorts of things. Of course, you're absolutely right. But I was talking in a very, very basic, very
Sure,
primary level.
that makes sense.
In a
And it ties
certain
back
level.
into what Luis was saying about that there's an astronomical basis for the zodiac,
Yes.
and that a lot of the traditional techniques go back to some sort of astronomical basis that is not purely, it's not just psychological, it's not just purely numerological or something like that, but there's often an astronomical reason that the rule is based on in some way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the structure. For example, measuring of cycles. You have it. It's astronomical. It's basically astronomical. Most of the meanings of the planets, traditionally speaking, come from their cycles. So there are appearances, and probably a lot of those older systems which we don't really have a history for. For example, the essential dignities, as we've seen from various academic studies, derive from that kind of cycle. The terms, for example, being the most obscure origin of them all, if I would suppose, they come from some sort of astrological cycle that is being observed and computed into that tables for some reason that we don't know, and probably changed a long time before we have a written proof, a testimony of that change, but it's still there. So all of that, it's very embedded in the core of astrology, and we need to understand that. And sometimes people say, oh, but that takes the mystic out of things, and it doesn't.
It's impossible to take the mystic out of things.
You can't. There's still the spiritual level of things. That's still the spiritual living, but that's being, if you want to talk, being one with the universe means to understand how the universe moves around us and surrounds us. And this, I think astrology is quite a doorway for that, and has been, historically speaking, a large doorway for mystical interpretation and mystical experience.
When people say that takes mystic out of things, it's like keeping the ignorance is better. And it isn't, because the more you understand, intellectually or in any other way, the more you understand, the more wonderful things are. There's the wonder. And every time you get a new level of understanding, be it intellectual or any other kind, you become more aware of the wonder of life and of the wonder of astrology, because it's really something that has been with us since the beginning,
since ever. And that's quite important. And I think people lost that connection to astrology being derived from the observation. And we see that, for example, I've seen that in recent years, where people sometimes have no idea that you can actually, and I've seen this a couple of times, and I will say this kind of just a joke, but it's true, unfortunately, which is people who practice astrology and didn't know that the planets were visible in the sky.
Sure.
And this unfortunately occurs, and this means that you have a cleavage, a complete cut between what the reality of astrology and its practice, which is frightening.
Right.
And
it's just a
today,
completely abstract thing, because people are just looking at a computer screen, or even the ephemeris, although the ephemeris does a better job of showing the movements, it's still abstracted to a certain extent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. They have no idea that astrology reflects nature. And so we had people who said, but we can see the planets. Can we see the planet if we go outside? I said, well, yes. And I'm talking about astrologers, practicing astrologers.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a joke.
It's a joke, but it's fortunately a very serious and worrying joke.
Sure.
And I think tradition at some level stops this, or at least blocks it, because you need to understand things. But it's still a problem. For example, I was thinking another problem we have is the lack of mathematical knowledge that a lot of the astrologers today have. Because computers do everything, and thank God they exist, or else we would spend weeks calculating charts because before we can have anything done. But for example, primary directions have been strangely out of predictive work for a number of years, partially because people still get them confused a lot, and there's a lot of opinions on systems and what to go what, but basically because you don't have a good program that calculates them, or and you don't have people who have a correct understanding of what they're looking at, because you simply can't do a list. For example, here we detected a lot of the time people coming from contemporary astrology who had the basic teaching would interpret the direction like they would interpret a transit. So if you have Saturn conjuncting Venus in the transit way, you would see Saturn affecting what Venus represents in the chart. But people forget that with directions, things work otherwise. So if Saturn as your significator is moving towards a conjunction of Venus, it will be Venus as the promiser of the chart that will affect what Saturn represents in the chart. Let's say it's the ruler of the ascendant. So, and this kind of rationale, it's lacking. So people really can't use directions because they don't understand them. And for example, this goes on to other directions which are used currently. In fact, for example, secondary progressions, which we stopped using a long time ago. But if we go and see where they come from, secondary progressions have the same rationale as primary directions, or any kind of direction.
And they were applied only for the luminaries.
Yeah, and they were applied only for luminaries, basically, and that got a bit messed. But that's a whole other history of late 19th century, early 20th century astrology construction. But and still, there's a rationale there that wasn't understood. So sometimes some certain techniques are applied incorrectly because you're not respecting the structure in which it's built, and we have a problem there. So we're not understanding it correctly, and it then falls back to what we were talking about earlier on. People don't really understanding the logic within astrology and going outside to get things in without really an understanding of the things.
Sure. So the revival of astrology, one of the things that's revived is obviously that logic and some of the philosophy and the conceptual structure of traditional astrology from prior to the modern period. But the other thing that's happened is in the past 2 or 3 decades, suddenly, or one of the reasons why your first book was important in 2010 when it came out is because there weren't other good introductions to traditional astrology. There were more advanced books that you could get, but you already had to take a lot for granted. And that's one of the reasons why your book has become so important over the past decade, because it was one of the first ones that you could really start studying astrology with from scratch. And maybe you might still have to refer to some other things, or maybe it might be a lot to dive into from the start, but you could pull it off. And that partially came through you guys being sort of like the second generation of traditional astrologers who'd been using the techniques for over a decade at that point and had internalized them enough to be able to not just know what it meant abstractly, but had been applying it in practice for a number of years.
Yeah, that was basically our idea at the time, because when we started to write the book, the Treatise, we on the heavenly spheres. The Treatise is the Portuguese name. what happened is that we had the books basically that exist were reinterpretations of pre-existing books. For example, you have all the work that Zoller had done with Bonatti and similar works where people were interpreting the words of someone else. And we started to see that being stuck to a same author or to one or two sources, it's not very healthy in terms of astrological education, because you're not seeing things on a wider perspective. For example, I remember problems which we had with Zoller's determination of the he leg, or Zoller, because he was reading Bonatti and he was saying, well, Bonatti does this, but it doesn't clarify. Yeah, that's true. But if you go beyond Bonatti and start to go to the sources Bonatti's reading, there are people who explain it better. There's always someone who explains a little bit better the technique than another author. It's my way of expression.
And Bonatti is a bit confused.
Convoluted.
And then
It's a good source, but very
Montulmo criticizes Bonatti a lot.
Yeah, and you have Montulmo
criticizing Bonatti, and
that's a funny thing going on there. But for example,
seeing the ancient astrologers criticizing each other, or it seems like I was reading recently, it seems like the primary motivation for Al-Kabizi writing his introduction is he thought that Habu Mashar was too long-winded, and that the introduction, that the lesser introduction was too short, but that the greater introduction was too long-winded. So he wrote something in between the two almost.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see, for example, one author that I like a lot is Ali Ben Rajel, because Ali Ben Rajel goes on and on saying, well, this guy says this one says that, and there's someone who has this opinion. And then he thought, but they're all wrong. I'm going to tell you how it is. And then he'll explain his digestion of the whole thing. Or, for example, Ezra, which is quite of a sharp-edged author who simply dismisses things. He has one very funny, which is the one...
It's about a technique for calculating something, the length of life or something. Yeah, and
there's this author which he said, well, there's this author, I don't recall the name, but you can check it later if you want to, is which he calls it the ovens or something. I'm not sure what the translation.
Very strange name for a technique.
The technique, the ovens. Okay. And then he says something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the technique is worthless, and all of that should be thrown into a oven because it's completely useless. And this Transfor dismisses that, and we have no idea what it is because we don't have the surviving book.
I think it's a very unknown, obscure author.
Yes, I don't think it's known outside of this comment, but it's interesting.
Ezra is very funny because he's just so sarcastic about everything. And so blunt, like this is not good, and that's not good.
So
what's interesting though is they often the traditional authors will usually state what the tradition was, or what the inherited tradition was, or what their sources are saying, and then they'll state their opinion. And it seems like that was a continuous thing throughout the tradition that we lost a little bit of in modern times.
Yeah.
That is also that is also because books. We have lots of books today, as you know. But the books you have in your library are probably more than the ones in the Library of Alexandria. In number, we have lots of books. And they didn't, because the books were manuscripts. So they used the books also as repository.
It's a repository of knowledge. So
even if they didn't agree.
They would repeat the knowledge that came to them, and then they would add their own. So this is a time technique. It goes out until the modern age, in which you have the commentary. So that's this commentary thing. And you have Ptolemy, for example, which is known through a lot of commentaries throughout the ages.
Or John of Saxony commenting on Alcibiades.
Or commenting on Alcibiades, and sometimes the word of the commentator is quite important because it's going to explain something that the original author didn't put forward.
Sometimes they used books as repositories of knowledge. So even if they didn't agree with something, they would write it down. They would keep it, and so we can see all the different opinions, and they don't eliminate them. They just keep them. And then they give their own opinion and they add their own knowledge from their own experience.
And this widening of sources, it's quite important because then you can see things being clarified which are a little obscure in another author, and that's quite important. And I was saying Ali Ben Rajal, for example, for us was quite important at a point, because his treatise is very complete. Although I wouldn't recommend it for beginners, because it is quite complicated to read it. It's a medieval construction, and he doesn't organize things, and that's, for example, one thing which is quite important when reading sources is sometimes the information you want is not in the order or in the chapter where you expect it to be. For example, I recall Ali bin Rajal has something on the importance of essential and accidental dignities. So we're always fighting about, which one is more important, which ones are really essential, which ones are just add-ons that you do. And suddenly he's discoursing on the length of life, and I think it's the Alcacodan bit or somewhere around that period. And then suddenly he stops what he's saying, and he says, and the most important the essential dignities are these ones, and the most important ones are accidental are these ones, which are then the opposite are those. So all of a sudden he's giving you a very precious information in the middle of something completely different. And this happens constantly. And that's why we sometimes need translation of an entire book, because something that might clarify a technique which is not clear will be in an early chapter where he's talking about the signs, and we would say, well, we weren't going to translate this because it's equal to everyone else, and sometimes it's not. And this is complicated to manage in terms of reading.
The book should be translated integrally. Yes. For instance, this author Ali Ben Rajal, I don't think you have an English translation.
Yeah, fragments, I think.
Fragments.
When he translated part, but not a lot. And you've had access to that through translations from Castilian, or how did you access that text?
Well, Castilian, yes.
Yeah, and that one was translated by Alfonso X in the 12th century. So there is a Castilian version from very early on, from the 13th century on. So and there's an edition. We had an edition of the Castilian version, and although we speak Portuguese, we can manage with medieval Castilian.
Yes.
Okay, so you're able to, because you speak Portuguese, you can read that translation in that critical edition. And was it translated directly from Arabic into Castilian?
Yes.
Yes. And they very interesting. They calculated the chart, an election chart, to begin the translation, and they incorporate this in the book.
Yeah, so we have the date, the time and date of the beginning of the translation, and the time and date of the ending of the translation, which is quite interesting.
For instance, returning to Ali Ben Rajal, he, for instance, when he talks about the terms, we think, the terms, they are the same for everybody. But he explains the terms in a very interesting way. He says that the sign, for instance, Aries, is like one color. For instance, red. Aries would be red because of Mars. And then the term of Saturn in Aries would be a brownish red. And the term of Venus would be a very soft red. And the term of the moon would be like a whitish red. So it's
the term of the moon, no, the term of Jupiter.
The moon, it's impossible. The term of Jupiter, and it goes on and explaining the terms inside each sign in terms of colors,
which is quite interesting, and really gives you an insight to how they're doing that and how they interpret the terms.
So they are like mixing colors.
So these are very subtle things that you pick up as you go through a source, and sometimes it's a phrase. And I've been studying manuscripts for the last 3 years very hardly for my PhD, and you have these. If you don't read the whole thing, you miss a phrase that will give you the answer to what you need. And this is quite important. And what happened, and going back to our book and how we build, is as we started to widen our sources, we were able to then filter out what is the essential. So the all heavenly spheres was built in this principle. So let's now explain this without having to recur constantly to the other author. And that was a choice, which was, we're not going to always being quoting an older source. We're just going to say which sources we are using generally, but we're going to build the rationale up from scratch. Because I think that sometimes you need to do that. Of course, if you're working more academically, as we are right now, you have to refer back to sources, and that's quite important if you're studying historically and if you're going back to sources. But at some point, if you want to teach someone astrology, sometimes you need to get your own things, and then you say, well, if you want to read a little bit more about this, then you go to Ptolemy, or you go to Abu Mashar, or you go to another author which explains it. But I think that's a level 2 in terms of astrology for someone who's learning. First, you need to have an idea of the system, and then you can advance to a direct source.
And mainly because our students, if they have a good idea of the system, they can deal with any source. They don't get stuck in small differences like this
Orb
author
numbers.
says the orb of Venus is 7 and the other says that it's 6. So it's, and they get stuck. And if they understand the idea, they don't get stuck because they have the concept.
Sure.
So this is something that we wanted to do, to teach astrology from scratch, without any other explanation exterior to astrology, and in a way that collects and I would say, collects and distiles, so to say, all the sources that we have read, instead of quoting.
Yes, and one of the things that we opt for is when you have a divergence of techniques. For example, the aspects, how are you going to calculate the aspects? And that's still an open question nowadays. If it is all sign, if it's not all sign, are they using 5 degrees? Are they using 7? Do they use the orbs of the planets? Is it moieties? It's the whole orb. How does it work? And there's not an answer for that yet, because sometimes that's not in the books. But what we did was we gave the 2 options that were at the time our understanding of how it worked, and William Lilly's moiety system, which was at the time one of the major sources for English readers and traditional readers, and still is in a certain way. So people would know, okay, there are different approaches to this, but the idea of the aspect, it's still the same thing. And I think that's important. And it's good for people to know that there are different opinions on certain minor aspects.
I mean, how do you deal with that divergence at this point? Because one of the issues that I've noticed over the past decade that astrologers are starting to run into in studying traditional astrology is that there used to be just a few sources, so it was very easy just to master the just handful of traditional astrology books that exist. But now there's such a huge diversity of different sources from the tradition, because Ben Dykes has translated like 30 books, and there's tons of academic translations that seem like they're coming out all of the time. And now it seems like there's such a diversity of opinions in the tradition at this point that sometimes people are struggling to figure out how to reconcile all of them, or what to do in the case.
I think you gave the answer already. You gave the answer already. You said the diversity of opinions. And that's exactly that, the diversity of opinions. Because if people read the sources, I think sometimes people just kind of fall in love with one source and they like that source very much, and that's fine. But they get this idea of this author and this source. So that what you mentioned is exactly what you said, the diversity of opinions. If you read different sources, and if you approach not horizontally, but if you approach that from another perspective, you can see the sources, and you must understand that each source comes from a different period, probably, or from a different culture, or from a different, slightly different kind of education. If you understand that, you can see what emerges is what they have in common. So you just don't get stuck with 1 degree of difference or something.
Yeah, for example, let me see. Usually the divergences occur with minor facets of the technique. I was thinking on receptions and definitions of reception, for example. That's usually people struggle a lot of that. But we have to think at one point, how important really is reception in an interpretation? Can you interpret the whole thing without giving that much importance to receptions? I think people are sometimes stuck because they're giving too much importance to that small detail. And we might have a doubt and we're interpreting something, so we might get it slightly off because we don't have the whole data, and we have also to assume that with astrology as with other interpretative technique. But you have to test it and see, okay, it might do this, it might do that, let's see. And the problem is people mostly use these things in natal charts. And in natal charts, it's complicated because it's extremely subjective. And if it's our own natal chart, it's going to be even more subjective. And sometimes these things have to be tested in horaries, events, stuff like that, which is more concrete. You have a result. Either that happened or didn't happen, or it happened like this, or it happened like that. With natal charts, it's quite complicated to test certain things. House systems is another major thing. And I think we're going to struggle with that one forever.
I mean, well, it's clear even that the medieval with some of the stuff that's come out from Abu Mashar recently, it seems clear that they were struggling with it to some extent, where they were inheriting both a sign-based tradition and a quadrant or degree-based tradition, and different astrologers were trying to figure out what to do with it, but nobody ever really solved that. It just sort of, it didn't completely go away as an issue, but the whole sign was jettisoned, and then it just became a debate over which quadrant system to use for a few centuries.
Yeah, and still, I don't know if there's an answer. It's going to be a good answer for that. Which one is best and why? Because it's just which one is. It's why is it better than the other one?
Right.
But still, I think we need, and I'm now speaking as an historian, we need examples as much as we can get them. And unfortunately, examples are rare. And as you go further into older periods, you have fewer and fewer examples. And it's only examples that clarify exactly how they use their techniques. Because there are books and sources that have examples, but usually they're incomplete. They're not very clarifying, and people have this tendency to pick the worst examples possible to clarify something. There's always something off that doesn't really explain it, and examples are very good. With the house systems, what I usually recommend, we use Alcabitius, and we have been using Alcabitius since the tradition,
also called the old system.
The old system, and mainly it's not I'm speaking personally now. I like the way it's calculated and the structure of the calculation, but I don't think a mathematical justification will do it alone. What I've been stuck with Alcabitius since then, because in predictive work I've found out that at least in example charts I've been making all these years, the cusps work better in terms of explaining events in predictive work. And I'm talking about cusps of intermediate houses. For example, people, if you're having a doubt in the cusp of the fifth, and it's either Leo or Virgo, and you see people having children or having issues with children when the sun is ruling something. It's the rule of the year, or it's the rule of the subperiod of the third eye, or something similar, and not Mercury. And this is a constant throughout the predictive work. And then you see, okay, so let's see which house system here will give me sun as the rule of the fifth house, and not Mercury. And then you try to select. And Alcabitius, for me, has been working fine. That doesn't mean it's the correct one, of course, because who knows? But I think things have to be tested on this level and with very objective things. And it's not going to be the way I relate to whatever subject in the chart that's going to really explain if the cusp is one sign or the other, because that's subjective and it's difficult to understand. I think we need to work it out with oraries and predictive work, stuff like that. That's very precise. Either it describes an event or it doesn't describe an event. And if it doesn't describe an event, then we have to go back to the calculations, to the mathematics, to the logic around it, and redo it again and rethink it again.
Sure.
And this is a very complicated process, and it still hasn't been properly done with astrology nowadays.
And also, practice. And also, sometimes I don't understand why people discuss certain matters in the sense that it does not contribute to a better practice. It's just a theoretical thing. So I think we should revert to practice.
Yeah, practice
Because
will give us the answer.
some of these discussions are completely theoretical, and they don't actually test. They just say, or they test in their own charts, which is not actually a test, and they just discuss some details that are not useful, I would say. So if they revert to practice, if they really put this in practice, as Luis said, I think most of these discussions would just, I wouldn't say go away, because they are important, I have to
Or
say.
they would raise the proper questions. Sometimes
Exactly,
we don't need the good answer, we need the good question.
Exactly.
Which question should be asking at this point?
Yes.
And we can't assume. And I think the problem with astrology, and this is traditional, modern, or any kind of astrology, is people tend to assume. People get too confident and tend to assume things. We all commit that error. It's a grave sin, but we all do it. And sometimes we need to go back and, well, let's turn down this to basics and see if it's really working, or if we're just wishful thinking it into action. And it's complicated. It's a complicated process. We need to revise a lot of our pre-concepts on something, and sometimes that's complicated to do scientifically.
Sure. Well, one of the things I've been noticing that's been happening in the traditional communities is there's a lot of new, sometimes debates that are coming up based on textual analysis when there's an ambiguity in the text and it's spawning multiple interpretations, which then are becoming new sort of sub-traditions in and of itself. Like one of them is the void of course moon definition. There's become a new debate about that, and you guys must be familiar with it because it's based on like Sue Ward's interpretation of what Lily was doing with the void of course moon, which is based on an apparent inconsistency from how he defines the void of course moon versus how he seems to use it in the chart examples, and one approach to defining what void of course means in that context versus the other alternative interpretation, which is the more common one, versus even now there's an older Hellenistic one that's been revived in the last 10 years where we found the original definition, and it was just talking about the moon not completing an aspect in the next 30 degrees, which is completely different than those. So now all of a sudden there's three void of course moon definitions that are being used in contemporary practice that are all derived from different sort of textual reads of different texts from the tradition.
Yeah. Well, my approach to that, and now I'm thinking historian and astrologer. As an historian, what I would do, and this is a project that we tend to do at some point, is we just comb whatever sources we have from the earliest one to the latest one, and see how that is defined.
How the concept develops.
How the concept develops, and not only in the theoretical manuals, which is usually 90% of our data, but also in practical examples where they are considering and interpreting the chart. Are they considering this a void of course or not? And then, astrology-wise, in terms of interpretation, what I usually say to students is this: well, just look at it. Instead of worrying too much if it's void of course or it's not void of course, what do you have there? Which is, for example, we don't know exactly how to extend the void of course of a moon, for example. But because, for example, some people say, well, it has to not make an aspect until it goes out of the sign. So there's that sign boundary thing. But the thing is, you have a chart with a moon that is not applying to any aspect. Is it void of course? Is it not void of course? Is it going to change sign? It's not going to change sign. All of that can be interpreted before you label it void of course or whatever you want to call it. So sometimes we, for sake of clarity, and this means in terms of astrological interpretation, you just have to forget the concepts and the names and the labels and read the chart and see what's happening. Describe what's happening to that planet. Then you can, at a conceptual level, discuss and study, should I call that a void of course or shouldn't I do it? So but I think that's the basic.
First, we have to be able to interpret. Yeah. First of all, before labeling anything.
Yeah. For example, a void of course moon in an horary. For example, it's just something where it's in a natal chart. It's not a big issue. But in an horary or an event, you have a void of course moon, and so the moon does not complete an aspect in any kind of orb.
Is that the definition of void of course that you use?
Yeah. Until it changes a sign. For example, it's going to change a sign. It's going to be at the end of Taurus, for example. It's going to shift to Gemini, and only when it enters Gemini, it will start to applying to a certain degree of an aspect to a planet.
So just to clarify, is that the definition of void of course that you use and prefer, is the one where the sign boundary does matter, or do you ignore the sign boundary? Let's just say I
usually ignore the sign boundary, I must say.
Okay, so you do follow Sue's interpretation?
Yeah. Because there's a practical issue there, and that's what I was going to. For example, how do you describe this in terms of an event? So you're having a moon in a certain sign, it's going to shift to another sign, and then it's going to apply to an aspect. And that's the order, the sequence that you need to be aware of when interpreting that event or that question. Is it void of course? Is it not void of course? Well, forget about that if you're in doubt, because you're going to be stuck with an interpretation of what a void of course moon is and implies in the chart, which is important, but you have that chart, which is a unique moment in time, which you need to interpret at that point. And what you're going to do is that you have the moon with a certain characteristic when you're doing the question. And you know if the moon is your indicator of action or movement in that chart, it's going to have to shift to another sign in order to accomplish something. Right. So that's what you need to interpret. So probably until something happens, there's going to be some kind of change in circumstance that you need to be aware of in order to answer that question. And then you have the context of the question that might allow you to understand exactly what does that mean in that specific case. And I think this is more important in terms of interpretation than being stuck to a rigid definition of what a void of course moon is or not. Same thing with reception, which is also a big struggle for people. Should we consider it? Should we consider if it's with triplicity and terms? Should we consider if it's two dignities, if it's one, if it's a major, if it's not? Well, don't worry about that too much. Forget the names. Look at the chart and see what's there, what's happening there. And then you can interpret and you can put in all these concepts and make out something important. For example, if you read tradition, you see that they give a certain amount of importance where you have reception by term. But that doesn't usually pop up too much if you read the chapter on reception. They don't usually refer to reception by term. But when you go into the interpretation and the delineation of the houses, that pops up constantly. Are they being in reception by term? Does that give it strength? So that means that they're attributing some kind of strength to that configuration. So is it a reception or not? It doesn't matter. What it matters is it's something that you might need to focus your attention on, because it might be important. So these kinds of things might help a student or someone who's interpreting to forget about these things. That doesn't mean that it's not important to discuss technical issues. How do we call these situations, and how do we going to define our own art and the terms of our own art? That's important. That's extremely important. But we can't be stuck there. And that's a way that we've been dealing with tradition and the contradictions of tradition a lot in this time. And sometimes we have to have in mind one thing. Sometimes there are mistakes. Sometimes we say, Abu Masar defined something strange. I was reading it the other chapter the other day, and I said, well, he made a mistake here, or the translation made a mistake here, or the manuscript copier somewhere along the timeline made an error. And it's obviously an error because everyone else says something different. So we need to have also good sense in this aspect, which is, well, they might do errors, and we've seen them doing a lot of errors.
Yeah, I can give you an example of an error, of several errors. I went to the British Library with my teacher, Liana Saif. I think you know her, at least by name.
She's
Liana,
written
she's
a work on
amazing.
Abu Mashar and also is at the Warburg Institute. She just did a translation of like the Picatrix that I'm excited about.
Yeah, she's amazing. She's amazing. And we went together to the British Library, and I asked for this book of Ali Ben Rajel in Castilian, and she asked for the manuscript in Arabic. And she read, and we had to speak very quietly because we were in the middle of the British Library. She read a segment in Arabic, and I read the same in Castilian, and we both translated it into English.
Wow.
And there were grave mistakes. For instance,
in the Castilian.
Yes, because the Arabic was the original. For instance, they have confused Saturn with Venus.
Wow. Okay.
They couldn't be more different. Also, there are words in Arabic that are, well, you know Arabic, and sometimes they are difficult to translate. For instance, they had something in red. We had noticed this. They had something that they said it is red, and it should be green, because red and green in Arabic are similar. They are written in a similar way. So
it's easy to mistake.
It's easy to make a mistake between red and green in Arabic.
As it is simple. For example, in Western manuscripts, sometimes they mix up Venus and Mercury a lot, because if you don't draw the crescent of Mercury on top well, and sometimes it's just scribbling up, you get an error.
Right.
So
that's one of the other hazards.
It is very important to look at the originals as much as possible. And as Luis said, to look at the original, the whole thing, not just a segment.
Yeah.
Because medieval books are not organized the way we organize our minds. They are different.
Yeah.
And you have practice.
I've talked to Ben about this. He's been on the podcast recently to talk about some of his recent books because he went back and learned Arabic so he could go back to the original manuscripts, because he realized that the Latin translations were sometimes wildly different, or were shortened, or the meaning was changed, or that the original language was richer than the Latin translation, so that there was a good reason to go as far back as you could in the original text.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very important thing, and important to do different manuscripts also in terms of translation, because sometimes if you stick to a manuscript, you'll get a version. If you stick to another, it's slightly different, because we're talking about hand copies. So people do make mistakes in hand copies. Although I must say, sometimes you have wonderful copies, and that was a whole art of copying books. And sometimes they didn't even know what they were talking about, because they wouldn't read too much, or they wouldn't know the language too much. But still, you need to do the critical editions, which is to comb the most manuscripts that you can find, the most important ones, and then see if there are differences. And sometimes there are. Like even in Arabic versions of a manuscript on astrology, you might find chapters that don't exist in other manuscripts, or errors in copy where they simply jumped a segment because either they didn't have it or they were making a mistake. And it happens. So it's important to have this analysis. Sometimes it's irrelevant in terms of the matrix of the doctrine, but sometimes it might clarify something that we're doubtful of. But even so, and again, I stress this again because I think this is very important for people studying astrology, is we cannot be, although this is important and this is absolutely vital work to be done, and the translations offers a rich opportunity to do this, we still cannot be too much strict with terminology, or else it's going to be a nightmare.
And we lose
in what sense?
the most important thing.
Yeah. For example, I'll give you an example from my work. I'm working at the time, so the transition between the 16th and the 17th century, where you have a strong focus of mathematics in astrology. So it is a time where you get those long tables where they attribute a point to every little configuration that you can find. And you can have that in a simple version, like you have in William Lilly. And notice I'm calling William Lilly stable simple. Or you can have it to aspects, every single aspect. So it's a moon, 6,000 Mercury, you give it 1 point. If it squares Mercury, you give it -1 point. And you get these very minute things, which I don't know how they would apply that, because the hours to calculate the whole
Right.
counting of a value of a planet. But you have these things, and if you get too much stuck into what kind of point am I going to give to a configuration, you're not interpreting it. You're going around if it's value 4 or it's 3, and then there's a struggle because you have a faction that says it's 3 and a faction that says it's 4, and
Right.
perhaps it's meaningless.
And you lose sight of the most important.
And that has to be said. And then, well, of course, there's experience. We see, does it work? Doesn't it work? So how?
Yeah,
And
and that's
also-
what's so important now, and that kind of leads into your new book, because you had about 10 years of traditional astrology under your belts by the time you wrote the first book on the heavenly spheres, which came out, at least the English version came out in 2010. But then it's now been another 10 years, and you've written a follow-up book, which is meant to be sort of like a companion or almost a commentary to the first book, and it's titled Traditional Astrology Course, Essential Concepts and Interpretation Basics, and it just came out this year in 2019, right?
Yeah.
There's the book.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I noticed, I looked at the old book again on Amazon, and I noticed there was a review where the top voted review gave it a good review and said it was an amazing book, but it said that there were so many concepts that were thrown at it that it might be overwhelming for a new student of astrology, and it almost needed like some sort of commentary or a teacher to guide you through the book, the first book. And it almost seems like that's what the role that this book serves, is to walk the person through and take them like as a teacher and sort of take them by the hand and guide them through learning traditional astrology from the basics.
Yeah, what we did was, let me think. I think it was 2010 when the English came out. We decided to do a course based on our classes, our live classes, in which we try to write it down and say, okay, if we're going to teach that as a class, so we've done the subject, so the theory. Now let's do the practice. How do you teach this in lessons? And that's how this book pops up. So he was published in Portuguese around
2012.
12,
I don't
11.
remember.
I don't recall exactly the date, but sometime around then. So the transition comes a few years after. So the book is already old, I must say, in terms of how we see things and how we do things.
We
but although
would
this
do
is a
it
revised
slightly
version.
different.
One of the things that's funny is I saw the other day on a forum, somebody was recommending your book. It was on like Twitter or Reddit or something like that. And they were recommending the English translation. And there was somebody that wrote in the comments, they were like, I wish there were more books like this written in Portuguese, because I can't read English very well. Then the person let them know that, actually I pointed it out. I said, well, the book was originally written in Portuguese, and gave them the link. So there's people finding your work in English that don't realize that there's Portuguese versions of it, and that are very excited to learn that.
Oh, that is good.
It's funny how
it goes
information
around.
circulates.
It goes around.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But we did the book as a sort of companion. So like we would find in an academic manual of some sort. You always have the theoretical book, and then you have the exercise book that guides you into the practical aspects of things. So we try to teach interpretation a bit more in this book, in this new book, than the original one, the On Heavenly Spheres, allows, because you can give examples, but you cannot be interrupting the whole thing. And as to the person to comment, and it's not the first time that it's too complicated, it has too many concepts. It's true, but we need to see astrology is complicated.
Right.
I think that's one thing that traditional astronomers in the last...
It's complex.
It's complex. It's not complicated. It's complex. It's a complex knowledge. And that's one thing that tradition offered us, is the view of this complexity. I remember always there's a tradition, I think it's from, I might be mistaken on this, but I think it's Robert Hand's translator. I think it's the Opusculum Astrologicum of Shonas. I think it's in that one, where he makes a rather non-academic footnote,
a personal
a very
footnote.
personal footnote, which I think is very interesting. Where he says, "Well, this is something like this is much more complex than anything we knew Western astrology had until this point. This is something done in the 80s, I think, one of the very first translations, and it's interesting because that's true when you come from what they knew back in the 80s, and then suddenly you get into this complexity. So wait a minute, this is much more complicated, much more complex, much more than what we are used to, and it's true, and it's very difficult. And I understand for someone who's coming into astrology, it's difficult to absorb all these concepts. It's true, but
we try to make them palatable.
Yeah, we try to make them as palatable as possible, but it's still complex. Yes, and sometimes you, as a student, you have to digest it properly to
Also-
be able to apply it. And
Also
that's
beca-
the gap. Sorry, that's the gap we try to fill with this second companions, I would say.
Exactly. Also because most people had studied some kind of astrology before, and there's nothing more difficult than to learn something the second time, because you learn something once and your neurons just get this path, and then you need to redo all this idea. So it's difficult to learn the second time. And one of the things that this our second book has, the second English book has, is we try to develop. We are always doing this because we think this is absolutely essential. We try to develop a specific method to teach astrology, a very specific. It's not a contemporary method. We don't begin with the planets or this. We begin with the system, and then we develop from there. And we try to think as a medieval or astrologer.
The structure of the heavenly spheres is based loosely on how an astrology manual would teach astrology in the past, in which you start by the system and then you build the whole rationale through the system out, with a few changes for a more contemporary way of thinking, because we need to adapt to current day thinking. We can't expect people to come back to a frame of mind that they don't have anymore, but it's still
exactly basic. They don't have anymore, and because we now are I would say very Cartesian. We are very very Cartesian. There's no other way to put it, and this is kind of a pre-Cartesian frame of mind, and we have to relearn this kind of thinking, and it's like learning a different language. We cannot just go with our own language and try to apply it. We have to learn a different language with a different grammar, a different rules, not only different vocabulary, not only different ideas, but different methods of applying these ideas.
Yeah. And someone coming from modern astrology, contemporary astrology, that might get difficult because you learned, as Helena was saying, you learned in a different way. So you structured your mind in a different way. And that's a very difficult point for some of the students. And we usually start, for example, Morinos, which was for a long time one of the major sources we had of a traditional thing. But Morinos is a very dangerous tradition because he's a revisionist, and
he was
not giving.
Changing
he's
things.
He's not giving you what the normal way that an astrologer coming from a medieval tradition into the modern era would work on. And for example, in that aspect, William Lilly is much better. And I think of being one of the latest sources that we have, and for English speakers, it's wonderful because it's in English and it can be understood in English. He still thinks as a medieval traditional astrologer would do, in which he he does a very good mixture of specific meanings coming from house positions or house rulerships with a general meaning coming from the planets themselves. So he managed to do that very well. So he's a good author to study if you're trying to understand how to think certain interpretations. And at the same time, because he gives you a lot of examples, you can see where he bends his own rules because he's working with a specific case, which is something that you see every astrologer in practice does that. You have the rules, and it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of, are you going to label that a void of course or not? Is okay, you have that problem, but then you have to shift the rules for
And
that
look at the
specific
chart.
case without violating the rules of astrology at the same time. So you have to keep on those boundaries of what's permissible in astrology, but adapting it to a specific configuration that you're facing.
It's interesting that you mentioned Lily, because I've recently, I spent 10 years focusing on the Hellenistic tradition, and I finally got my book out, and then I've been more recently going forward to the end of the tradition and studying Lily, and I just did an episode on Lily last month with Nina Griffin, and also starting to study Marinus and some of those other authors. So I'm almost going the reverse direction from some other traditional astrologers that started with the Renaissance and then went backwards. But it's interesting, that contrast that you had with Lily, where you feel like Lily is more of a traditionalist, whereas Marinus is more of a revisionist in some ways.
Yeah, I do.
Yes.
I do. Marinus is revising astrology to fit a specific belief that he has and a specific belief of that time, in which they're trying to astrology to fit the scientific changes and the mindsets changing that are occurring in the 17th century. And he starts to do a terrible thing, which they all do in one point or the other at that period, which is they start to extracting out parts of astrology they think are not rational. And their definition of rational, it's dangerous
Very
because
narrow.
it's very narrow.
Okay.
For example, the system of terms gets completely dumped out, and a lot of interpretations get dumped out. And that is a process that's much earlier than Marinus. And we have
Sure. Well, what's interesting,
that.
how Lily's already changing stuff through the back to Ptolemy movement as one of his things. I mean, is that one of the major areas? Because you guys seem like you specialize more in, let's say, medieval astrology, roughly speaking, compared to Renaissance astrology. Where is Lily, although he's a good synthesizer, where does he differ in major ways from the medieval tradition? Or how do you see as medieval astrologers, Lily is different from what the medieval astrologers are doing, aside from, is the back to Ptolemy thing and the fact that he sides with Ptolemy so many times when there's discrepancies, is that one of his major differences with the medieval tradition, or are there other major departures?
Yeah, there are. Let's see. We have to see that Lily, although is good, and I keep what I told earlier, there is a very good example to study. He's on the end line of a tradition that has been changing since the late 15th century. And Helena, in her PhD thesis, focused on
the late 15th century,
on those changes of Ptolemaic astrology, and those discussions: should we use these terms or the other? So you have a shift in essential dignities. You have a shift on meanings of houses. You have a shift on several minor aspects of the tradition. Some are completely driven out. So when we get to Lily, there's a lot of these changes already occurring and already setting down. So, for example, his change of triplicities. So he's using only two triplicities. So any interpretation that you have in the medieval tradition and in the Hellenistic of using three triplicities to calculate times, meanings, whatever, it's gone. It has been gone for 2 centuries almost.
Okay.
They lost it. The terms are Ptolemaic, are not Egyptian, but that shifts them also to Orthodox. I think that would be a major problem. But for example, the use of the predictive techniques is completely different. Although I would recommend, and we do that with our students, to study his textbook on how he does the prediction, because he does a wonderful interpretation of primary directions. Even if we consider that he's using the Kepler aspects, so what we call today the minor aspects. If you ignore the minor aspects, if you're not going to use them, at least we could look at how is he interpreting certain connections of the planets, whether if it's a big quintile or a square, it doesn't matter. We just need to see what he's doing. But for example, he remits the the progressions, the perfections, to a very low role in the whole system, while the perfections are the core of any interpretation of predictive work since whenever they came up with them and then they developed the system. They are the central core that makes the whole system unite, in which you have the revolutions and every other information coming in by the guidelines of the perfections. So he lost that. He is not using that, although he makes excellent work with combining directions and solar revolutions. So there's a major change from the tradition, in which he dumps completely the ruler of the year, almost doesn't make any
Okay. And that actually raises a question for me just about your practice. Do you perfect by sign or by house? Because I'm noticing that this is becoming a large debate in the tradition, partially due to the house division issue, but also due to that splitting off in the medieval tradition as a result of the house division issue.
Well, by sign, we do
by sign.
What we do and teach is you do the whole movement of the points of the chart, of the significators, degree by degree throughout the year. So they will all do the 30 degrees in 1 year.
Okay.
And you note the aspects they do to the natal chart, and you note the changes. And for example, in terms of rule of the year, which is a major central focus of the interpretation, if you have a change, so if you say you have 20 degrees Capricorn rising, after 4 months in terms of timing, it will shift. Well, Capricorn
is not
Aquarius,
a good example.
not a good example would be Saturn, but there will still be a shift. So, for example, from 20 Aquarius, 4 months afterwards, you have Jupiter coming in as the ruler of the year. And this is what we've been doing, and our experience, and here again I remit to experience, has been giving excellent results in terms of if you see the shift in the sign where the ascendant moves, representing a major shift in the person's life. And we've been using directions, solar returns, perfections, and transits occasionally for the predictive work. And you see very well the major shifts. The timings work excellent with the perfections.
Yeah.
More sometimes than you would work with the direction or a transit, which is
and just to clarify, because last month there was an episode on perfections that'll come out before this episode, but that means so you calculate the degrees and then you move everything forward at a rate of 30 degrees a year, and therefore
mainly the heliacal points.
Mainly like the sun, moon, and ascendant.
The sun, moon, ascendant, the
part of fortune, and the midheaven and the part of fortune.
The part of fortune and the midheaven, yes.
Basically,
because we replace the CGG by the midheaven in perfections.
Yeah.
Okay. So then it's also almost more like a progression or like a primary direction, in that it's moving forward at a certain rate each month, and then some of those points that you're directing will change signs at different times during the year, which will then indicate shifts during the course of the year.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's it. And you can, of course, use the other planets, but we were talking about two, like you do in the primary directions, but it's too fast to have all the planets moving there. You might do that if you're looking at a specific house ruler, for example, if a person asks you for a specific topic. But if you're doing just the general thing, you use the hierarchical points basically to do the major shifts in the year, and this is something that we extracted from our reading of Ali Ben Rajal and other authors, because they seem to hint at this kind of movement in one point or the other. In between certain words, you see, well, if he's saying this, he has to be using a degree technique, not a sign technique or a house technique. But you still see, for example, in Ezra, I think it's Ezra. My problem is it's so many people, so many authors, I sometimes mix them up. I think it's Ezra. At some point lists a number of lists the main movements that you will consider in prediction. And he states both the perfection by sign and by house. So sometimes they're doing two things, or they're doing a quick method by house, which is easier to calculate, and at the same time they're doing the directions by degree. So I would love to tell you, well, they're doing this, they're doing that.
And there was one other area I meant
Sorry.
Sorry, it skipped for a second. Didn't mean to interrupt, but there was one other area I meant to ask when you're talking about reception, which is another debate that's come up recently, again, amongst traditional astrologers based on different textual interpretations, where some of the Renaissance astrologers are reading Bonatti, and there's a couple of delineations where he's doing like horary questions for the 6th and 8th house, where they've interpreted it to mean that reception, that malefics are mitigated when they receive other planets in their domiciles, but that malefics do not mitigate when the malefic is in the domicile of another planet and there's reception, that it's not a mitigating thing. And this seems to be coming out of it's a textual interpretation of one text, primarily of Bonatti, but then there's a debate compared to the other medieval authors who seem to say that reception is like a universally mitigating factor when it involves malefics. Is that a debate that you're familiar with, or do you have like a strong opinion one way or another on that debate?
That's one of those where I would look at the chart first before making a decision. Okay. I was thinking, for example, if you have Saturn in Cancer squaring a Mars in Libra, where you have both debilitated malefics.
And the one in Capricorn?
Well, if you have that kind of configuration, it's going to be a harsh configuration, whatever it signifies, even if you consider that there might be receptions or stuff like that. So it depends, really. I would what I would like to do at this point, when I have a 72-hour day to work with, would be to really look at the sources and see what's happening. I'm always very cautious of Renaissance interpretations of medieval authors, because by the end of the 15th, as I was telling earlier, and the 16th century, they're revising a lot of things. So we need to be very careful how they're interpreting things. I would go for the medieval. Usually the medieval sources are more in line with the tradition. They're more consistent throughout the tradition, with a lot of exceptions, of course, than the Renaissance. Because in the Renaissance, there's a cut there. That doesn't mean that you don't have excellent works doing there, and an excellent synthesis of astrology, quite good. But still, they're working into, they are changing certain concepts within astrology. They are cutting down, they're simplifying, they're trimming it down for a more logical approach to astrology, and we need to be careful when doing that. So that's where I think history of astrology is very important, is to understand,
especially the history of techniques. That's our project, studying the history of techniques. And also, when you ask something like, do you think reception is better this way or better that way? My question is, how much does this? I really need to look at the chart and see how much does this change, because as Luís said, both planets would be debilitated. So how much in practice? How much does this change?
In practice, if you're looking for reception to mitigate a hard configuration,
well, you might be disappointed.
There you have the answer. You're already trying to search anything that might soothe something that you know it already at the start. That's difficult. So that's a big point. I think reception can mitigate certain difficulties, of course, but
doesn't solve the problem.
It doesn't solve the problem. It's not. It's a third level of the interpretation of that configuration. Okay, it might soothe. It might change things. A term might do that. For example, I verified if you have a debilitated planet, which is in its own term, it usually gives you a much more efficient way of acting than one that it's not. And that in itself might mitigate a difficult configuration. So we really need to look for it.
I think one of the main problems, and problems here is like one of the main questions in astrology would be to understand how much each factor really is important. For instance, if you have the reception, as Luis said, is it something that is life-changing, or it's just a detail in a difficult configuration, as you asked? Or if you have a good term that will help slightly. So how much does all these factors contribute to the chart? And we have to look at the chart. And again, we have to go back to the chart and look at the chart as, I would say, like a singularity. This chart, even if we have people with the same chart, they are different people. So each chart is a singularity, and we have to look at the chart integrally. If we focus too much in one thing, or if we just extract one of the concepts and discuss the concept theoretically, we might lose sight of its practical application. And we are not, by saying this, we are not trying to escape the question. It's really the way we work.
And I was thinking, for example, debilitated planets, which is always a question. Is it debilitated? Is it not? Does it harm the planet? How much does it harm? Is it useful? And that's questions that pop up as you study. And what I've always said to students is we have to see that even when a planet is debilitated, the planet will have a certain interpretation. For example, you see that in manuals, and where you have, for example, let me think if I can get a good one, Mars in Cancer, where they sometimes say they're good in businesses and they're good.
Well, it has triplicity.
So you have a debilitated planet, and they give it good attribution. So they give it a specific attribute for that configuration, and it's still debilitated, and it will have its problems, but it's still able to act in a specific area and produce a specific effect, which is positive or constructive, or the person can use it constructively. And we need to focus that. Because if we're getting too much into, again, labeling, this is a debilitated planet, this is whatever, it's complicated. And I've only seen in practice, and you lose sight. And for example, in debilitated planets, they usually, this I've seen in practice and in textual evidence, which is, it's only when a planet is extremely afflicted that you really see the bad things. When you have a debilitated planet, which is at the same time retrograde and has a square of Saturn, and it's combust, and everything just comes in together, then you have a huge red alert because you might have a problem being signified by that planet. But you need to have a very heavy configuration to be clear on this. Just a debilitated planet, it's not
right.
enough.
Well, and that's one of the things why I think mitigations are kind of important, though, and represent something that's unique that traditional astrology has brought to the table in contemporary astrology, because in 20th century astrology, even concepts like benefic and malefic were rejected under the premise where they would say, we'll see Saturn in this chart, sometimes this person's had very terrible events in their life, and sure, it looks quote unquote malefic, but then they'll point to another chart and say this person, Saturn is perfectly fine in their chart, so it's not okay to call it a malefic. But they were part of the technical thing that was missing from that discussion was that traditional astrologers would always take into account a host of mitigating conditions that could alter the condition and the manifestation of any planet. But that's where one of the considerations like reception comes into play, because it's one of many potentially mitigating conditions that help you to identify what is the worst case scenario versus what are the shades of gray in between.
Yeah.
And there are more than 50.
Sure.
Yeah, and it is a complexity. There it is. It's I would say it's more organic in terms of tradition, because you have all these subtleties that have to come into mind. For example, I'm thinking again, a debilitated planet which is right on the MC. It will define a lot of the profession, and it doesn't need to be negative in itself. Again, the dispositor of that planet might be in a good condition, in a good house, and with certain dignities. You might have an aspect of a benefic planet or of a luminary that stabilizes that. You might have an IE's condition, for example.
Even debilitated, yes.
Yeah, which stabilizes the action of the planet. So you need to have that into account, and it's extremely useful.
And the planet, although in the 10th house, is not the only one to define the person's perfection.
Exactly.
For instance, the ruler of the 10th, the three planets of vocation.
The vocation,
well,
all of that. And so you need to mix up these things properly. And you're correct. It has a palette of mitigations and of complexity of interpretation, which is important. But we cannot be too stuck on it, or else I think the problem with the discussion sometimes is that we stick too much to definition. And again, I say it's an important thing to define one's tools and one's concepts in a science, in a body of knowledge, as astrology is. But then we have the practice, and we need to sometimes go over it to get an answer.
Sure. I guess I just wanted to establish if you guys see reception involving malefics as a universally mitigating factor, which seems to be the statement that's in a lot of medieval texts, or if there are exceptions where you don't see mitigation as a mitigating factor at all, which is a new development or a new opinion that some traditional astrologers are stating.
Well, what we see is that let's see how we can put
it is a mitigating factor, but it depends of what kind of reception we are talking about.
Yeah,
if they are both debilitated.
Exactly. If you have both debilitated planets, they will assist themselves. Yes, they will assist each other, but they're debilitated. So the level of assistance one can give, it's limited.
Yeah.
It's like we have to follow the root principle of that, which is disposition. So if a planet is moderately dignified, let's think, but its dispositor is very weak in the chart, it will affect the outcome of that planet, because the planet that gives you, even if there's no reception, so if the planet that rules that area, which defines part of the characteristics of the sign, is injured, so it won't assist that much. Or if you have a reception, it won't assist that much. So that's the root principle. So reception has to come from the basic, which is disposition. It's a development of a specific condition of disposition. So if we say that, well, the ruler of the ascendant has triplicity, but its dispositor is exalted, so the moderate condition of dignity is a bit uplifted. Okay, so if it's on fall, it stumbles a bit. It's more unstable. So the same principle should be applied to reception. So if the planet is debilitated, it can help. Yes, there's goodwill. Yes, but if it's debilitated, it doesn't have the power to act in its full. So
it helps, yes.
It helps. I would say yes, it mitigates somewhat, but it doesn't help as much as a reception by a strong planet. So that would be our position on the topic, I think.
Sure. And I wanted to ask you, while we still have time, about your academic projects, because one of you just recently completed your PhD and the other is about to finish yours, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you first.
Well,
you finished.
will be. Well, I have finished my PhD, and now I have. I will be in Germany for 6 months for a postdoc. About again with the topic of astrology. So I'm really very lucky because I get to work in what I love. And Luís is finishing his PhD, I think in May.
Yeah, in May we're organizing a conference here, an academic conference on the history of astrological techniques. We should have details about that around November, I think.
With wonderful scholars, we are very happy.
We gathered 5 to 7 scholars. We still have to confirm everyone, and we'll be discussing exactly history of astrological techniques.
Oh, we can say the names of people who already confirmed.
Yeah, we already have
Charles
Bonnet,
Professor Charles Bonnet,
Dorian Greenbaum, which we have already spoke of today. We'll have Shlomo Sella. Professor Shlomo Sella is also coming, which is an expert in Ezra, and he's done wonderful translations and editions of Ezra, which I would recommend anyone to get. And
Stephen
van der Broeke is also coming. He worked a lot on astrology teaching in Renaissance period. And who am I missing? David Just, which is a wonderful researcher on terms of astrological manuscripts and also techniques and authors. So I think we got a nice team to start up a debate.
Someone else. There's Dorian, Charles, Stephen, David, and
us.
Well, us. Yeah, but there was someone. I think it's 6 people. Well, there's us.
Well, we had a few people confirming, others unfortunately couldn't come. So we'll have it, but we'll have that information soon, and we'll send it to you.
And that will be in May in Batalha, which is a Gothic monument. It's a very beautiful monastery. And now it's converted into a cultural center. It's a beautiful monument, Gothic.
So we're going to be talking about astrology and history of astrology in
academic context.
An academic context, of course, is academic sponsored conference, and let's say it's going to be the startup of a project which we think it will be useful to get into the history of astrological techniques and astrological practices, which I think it's quite useful for those, especially those studying tradition. Yeah. I think it will be a good output for them in the project.
And this is part of our ongoing project, the Astro project, which is exactly the study of astrological tradition, because the study of astrological techniques, and it's more like an internalist study, because we have very good work in the history of astrology, very good, I would say, but most of these works are from the externalist point of view, like the impact of astrology in society, or the impact of astrology in religion or something, or political aspects, like Monica Zolini, she has done a very good work in the political aspects of astrology, or Rutkin,
the also philosophical and the cosmological and all that. So
we have people doing excellent
Rutkin, the
work.
person that was missing.
Yeah,
He's
Rutkin is always.
Rutkin's also going to speak there. Wow,
coming with us. Yes,
that's a dream team of like all of the current leading scholars academic scholars on the history of astrology right now.
Yeah.
And the place where it's going to happen is also very, very, very nice.
And we expect to publish the results then. We'll see. This is still in the making. But
we were saying most people have done very good work from the political, social, and religious aspects of astrology. And there are a few works on the technical aspect of astrology, and this is what we want to develop. We want to collect all the work that is already done, and it's very good. There's another scholar we would love to have with us,
Stephen Eileen,
who
published a very excellent article on the terms and the Ptolemaic terms and its historical background.
But he couldn't come.
Unfortunately, he couldn't come.
Also,
that's too bad.
But we see still on the team, let us say, and we hope to produce some in the following next years. We will hope to produce some good work on historical research of astrological practices, technical, and how they influence it. Because one of the things that has been very important in the history of astrology nowadays is that people are starting to realize, historians are starting to realize, that astrology has influenced a lot of the technical advances, for example, with astronomy. For example, instruments reflect a lot of the astrologer's needs, and that's a very it's opening up the field. Nowadays we can find a lot of excellent scholarly work done on this topic, but we want to do it from the point of view, as Helena was saying, from the internalist point of view.
Yeah.
See, how does astrology operates itself as a knowledge in several epochs, and how does it develop? How does it work, the inner discussion? What we're talking about? How does it work, the inner discussion on concepts? For example, the example you're giving, reception. How does it change from a certain concept in Hellenistic or medieval traditions, and then pops up into the Renaissance with a different perspective? How did that came to be? Is there a logical reason? Is there a rationale behind that change? Or it's just, as you said, a possible interpretation of a specific text which became influenced at a certain point? So if you understand that, if you understand this history and this development, you can more or less understand practice and all the consequences that this kind of thinking, changes in thinking might have.
And hopefully not get stuck in problems.
Yeah, and it might help solve practical aspects. See, should I consider this? Should I consider that? How does the concept change through time? And then if we know that, and if we have a good research done on that kind of aspect, then we can make better decisions in how to use it in terms of practical astrology.
Sure. Or at least to make a more informed decision if you understand all of the different options that are available.
Yeah. And it's always a matter. There's always a room for opinion and personal experience in astrology, and sometimes there aren't the fine answer, the answer for everything. We see that in the tradition, and people have.
Are there ever any instances where you two have notable practices that are different from each other, or are they all largely the same?
Well, in general, they're the same, although sometimes
we are like Siamese twins.
Right, yeah.
So sometimes we might give different emphasis to certain aspects of a chart. For example.
The thing with astrology is that there are different emphases that we can. I always say it's like going to a museum. If 5 astrologers talk about the same chart, it's like 5 people going to a museum, looking at the same painting, and then coming out and someone asks the 5 of them, like, describe the painting to me. If they are good and if they all look at the same painting, they should describe the same thing. But each of them would use different words, or they would emphasize different aspects of the same painting. And it's a bit like that. We might probably emphasize a few things.
That's a great analogy.
It is because they are all looking at the same image, and they should describe the same thing. But some of them would say more about the I don't know, the landscape or the color or the frame or whatever. It's always the same thing, and it should be coherent.
Sure.
And there's no contradiction in terms.
Yeah, it's an there is a room for interpretation, and the interpretation will be slightly different from person to person, but it still needs to give us the same result, or within the expected results. And I think that's the thing.
Sure.
Actually, I would like to tell you something that is something that we presented on an academic conference. It's about a comet, just for you to see how the astrological system can be flexible and solid, because it's so old and so time-tested that it becomes very flexible at the same time. It's about the 1618 comet.
Yeah, we were doing this very small study for a presentation that we have to give on the anniversary of the 1618 comets, which were they had a very strong impact on the scientific level, because there was this discussion: were the comets a phenomenon of the upper atmosphere, so of the fire region of the 4 elements, or was it a celestial event? And according to Aristotle, it couldn't be, because the heavens would be perfect. So this is a discussion in the early 17th century.
And then there's this big comet, and really impressive.
This set of comets which help measure the parallax, so they can place them properly in the heavens. So they would place them in the upper sphere, so there would be a celestial phenomenon. And the
Right.
question we might ask, and this is the interesting, how did this impacted the astrological interpretation of comets?
Sure.
And how does it work? And you think, well, they would have to destroy the whole system. No, they didn't. What happens is those that
Those astrologers,
interpret it as a sublunar phenomenon, so a physical phenomenon of the upper atmosphere, use the old traditions to ascribe the characteristics.
In this specific case, they would say the comet looks like so, and therefore it's of the nature of Mars and Mercury.
Mars and Mercury.
Mars and Mercury.
There's a rationale. And then we have this man who's writing also an almanac in Portugal, an interpretation of the comet, says, no, they're wrong. This is a celestial phenomenon which is located in the sphere of Mars.
And Mercury.
And if it's located in the sphere of Mars, it will have a martial quality. So what happens is immediately and without any question, you simply shift the interpretation. Okay, we need to know the nature of the comet in order to understand its effects. In what sphere is it positioned in the sphere of Mars? Then it will have Martian qualities. And this is adaptive. So they don't change. There was no change in the interpretation. Simply the reason why they're attributing a given quality shifted because there's new knowledge for it.
So there's a minor modification of the system.
Yeah,
exactly.
It should be like something destructive to the system because the comets, after all, they are not sublunary. They come from the outer space. And it isn't. It is not destructive. It's very simple. Simply the astrologers would fit the comets in the system, but in another part of the system. This is just, it's almost like an anecdote, just for you to see how flexible and resilient the system is. So I think all these discussions that we are having about reception or the orbs or all sorts of things, they are not a threat to the system. They are simply something that should be integrated in a different level. That's the thing.
It's, for example, the aspects and the orbs. You can always say, but we do have all signs. We can use all signs and then forget about the orbs. And you see sometimes that in practice, in which you have astrologers that are using orbs, but at the same time, but these planets are not in orb, but they are in opposing signs. So there's an opposition. And if they're in a chart in opposing houses, there's an opposition there. It might not be a strong one because it's not within the orb and that doesn't have the specific degrees in which you consider an aspect, but there's still two opposing forces within that sign and those houses. So you need to account them. And they will do it in practice.
To a certain degree. And it's a matter of degree. And for instance, in my PhD, I studied a manuscript, late 15th century manuscript, and it had examples, which is really good. So this man, this astrologer, he would account aspects by degree, as he said, and by house. And he writes that. And the one thing he says, this Jupiter is not aspecting whatever, neither by degree nor by house. So we can see that he uses both. For instance,
could you explain your PhD and what that was on?
It was about a manuscript. Well, it's actually interesting because I found out a manuscript. We both found out a manuscript. We knew of a manuscript in Lisbon. And it was like an almanac from 1468 to 1480, so 13 years. And in the end of the almanac,
a sort of an ephemeris.
Sort of an ephemeris, yes. Planetary positions, just dry planetary positions. But in the end of the manuscript, we had about 40, more or less 40 horoscopes of 15th century French people, like kings and things like
Dukes, princesses,
yes.
so famous people from the
the rich and the famous
Famous
from the late 15th century France.
yeah.
Okay.
And then I went to Professor Charles Burnett, and I said, I think I would love to study this document. Could this be enough for a PhD? And he said yes, and he was very supportive. And then I began my PhD in September for 2014, and when we got to the Christmas break, December, so 2 months in, Charles said to me, "You should talk to David Just, who was there in London, because he has something that is very similar to your document." And I had my computer with me, and David has his computer, and I said, "Okay, I'm going to show you my document." And I opened my computer. David showed me his document, and when we turned the computers, it was absolutely equal. So we had something in the La Bibliothèque Nationale de France, so in France, in Paris, and I had a document in Lisbon, and they were both written by the same person. It was not the same document. They were different documents, but they were written by the same person. It was absolutely the same handwriting, the same astrological symbols, and there were cross references. We found out that there were cross references between the documents. And the other document, the one that David had, was signed. There was a name there. There was an explicit with a name. An explicit is the end of the document in Latin. This was Latin.
Written by...
And this was written by me, S. Belle. So it was the same person. So I got the second document, and this was astrological doctrine all over, and several examples of charts that he interpreted.
So it's like an introductory text?
It was more like he collected them for him.
Sort of personal
from
notes.
Different authors. He collected this like a student. And this is that's why I called my PhD The Making of an Astrologer, because it's like how he studied, how he collected, what kind of mistakes he had. And then he has another collection of charts also in the second document. So it's very, very rich. On the one hand, I have an almanac with horoscopes. On the other, I have astrological doctrine and interpretations, yes.
Examples,
most of it in Latin, but one of them in Old French. So it was just a matter of translating, and then commenting this. And because I had examples, it was very rich. I had theory and practice. So it was very, very rich.
And this is what I was telling earlier, which is with examples, you can know how they're applying the
how
techniques.
They actually did it.
Right.
One of the very interesting things I saw, because he draws the maps, as you can imagine, he uses the 5-degree rules, the 5-degree rule graphically. For instance, in one of the horoscopes, the ascendant is, let's say, for instance, 8 degrees Taurus. 8 degrees Taurus, for instance.
Okay.
And Mercury is like a 5-degree Taurus. Technically should be in the 12th house, but he draws Mercury in the first, although he keeps the degree. Correct. And if you don't know what it is, it looks like a mistake.
Right.
Because it's like in the wrong place. But what he's doing, and he does this consistently, is pulling the planet into the right house because of the 5-degree rule, but keeping the right degree in the planet. So it's puzzling for someone who doesn't know the rule.
Yeah,
but
I love that. And that's
rule,
the advantage of you being astrologers and having that background, is that something you immediately probably recognized or realized, whereas somebody, maybe an academic coming that doesn't have that background, might not catch it, perhaps. I mean, somebody
Yeah,
really good like Stefan Hyland would probably catch that, but some non-astrologer, there's others that might not.
No, Stefan is great.
For example, let me tell you one that's usually wrong, which I was just the other day while reading an almanac, and I popped up with a good proof of that, which is people used to say when certain person is born under a sign.
Yeah.
And you would one person with the normal culture would say, "Oh, was born under a sign, so he was born with the sun in that sign, so in a specific date of the year." While on an older almanac, so until the 17th century, what they're saying is the person was born with that rising sign.
Right. So if they say when you're born under that sign, it means your rising sign, not your sun sign.
Exactly.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
And you can see that what they're talking about. What the problem is when they're looking at this at almanacs, for example, you're seeing this packed in together with weather interpretation as well for that sign. And weather interpretation depends on the solar sign because you're talking about the season of the year, basically. And
it's confusing.
It's confusing. But if you read exactly what they're talking about, you will see that they're talking about descendants and are not talking about sun signs.
And you can give the example of Taurus.
Yes, and the example here in this almanac was obvious because he said something like, if people have Taurus rising, they will tend to provoke their own illnesses because the sign in the Venus rules both the sign in the first house and in the sixth house.
Which is Libra.
So he's using a generically 3-degree equal house to exemplify this. But there you have it, the proof. This can only work if you're considering a Taurus rising sign, not the sun sign. It wouldn't make sense. And these little things that you pop up here and there, and they change the perspective in which you're seeing things. Because I've seen people saying, "Oh, yeah, but the sun signs are not as modern as you think because you see them in almanacs." No, you don't. Unless they state it specifically, and there might have been some almanacs where that is stated, but most of them, if you look again, it's not a sun sign that they're talking about. It's a rising sign. So you would immediately extrapolate. Probably earlier texts are also mentioning that. You wouldn't have that problem in a primer of astrology, of course, because then you're having a serious astrology. But in these small texts, probably done by more amateur astrologers or for the greater public, you need to understand that exactly what they're saying.
Yeah, and sometimes you have people that collect knowledge, but they also tend to condensate knowledge, and they just collect some parts. And it's confusing if you go there without knowing what they are saying and read, because it is confusing. They are mixing a sign as a rising sign and then a sign for weather, for instance. And also, and we talk a lot about this, we think that there's a great part of astrology that was transmitted directly from teacher to student. Orally.
So we don't have that. Or don't have too many testimonies.
The personal experience, the little tricks of the trade, the secrets, this was probably transmitted directly.
Yeah, that's something that's only being revived now, all of a sudden with traditional astrology, where we're suddenly having a living, breathing tradition of traditional astrology again, but it's only, two generations old, maybe 3 generations now.
Yeah.
But back then, and we have very little documentation of that, although there's little hints of it, like Abu Mashar's student Shadan and his little text that I don't think has been translated at this point, that is like anecdotes from his teacher Abu Mashar, where he talks about his students sitting around and watching a chart reading of Abu Mashar, and then afterwards asking him, like, why did you say that to the client, and then him explaining.
And there's no, because I would love to read that text of Shadan. I saw references to it, but there's no translation, I think.
Yeah, there's like an article by Lynn Thorndike where he paraphrases a bunch of it, and Ben has done a little rough translation from the Latin, and I'm encouraging him, and he's in the process of gathering up Arabic manuscripts to translate it now. And then he told me recently that there's some academic he met in the process of doing that who may be doing a critical edition of the text.
That would be wonderful. Yes.
That's one thing that we need a lot. It's critical dictions of sources, especially from languages which are not easy to. Because even if we knew Arabic, for example, one thing is Arabic, another thing is medieval Arabic.
Right.
It's complicated. Latin is not an easy language, unfortunately. We can handle it, but it's still a complicated language to read from. And that's valuable, a very valuable resource, which is academic translations.
It
So
seems like
yes,
language skills, learning ancient languages, and developing, having an academic training in historical studies and some of the things that come along with that are two of the most valuable skills that traditional astrologers can have today.
yes, it is very important to have at least some kind of historical context for things. Because, for instance, one of the things that when we discuss techniques or which is better or kind of reception or what is better, we have to think of sources and cultures and periods, because some things are natural for a certain period or for a certain author because he lived in a certain place, and it is immersed because he was immersed in a certain culture. So we need to have context. We need to have historical context. There's not one technique, I think, that is immutable throughout all the history. They all change a little, and they change, but still they keep the concept there.
The
It's
essence
there. The essence
Yeah,
is there.
that's important thing
So
to
if you
understand.
discuss the details, we have to have context to make sense. Otherwise, it seems like they are just making it up.
Yeah, I was thinking for something, for example, one, I don't think anyone still catch up to that in practical terms, which is the value of dignities. We usually attribute 5 to house, 4 exaltation, 3 to triplicity, 2 to term, 1 for face. But there is a point where you see the Arabs doing a switch on the terms and the triplicities, where they're giving 3 to term and give it more importance than triplicity in terms of the whole weighing. And that will change our mutums and scoring of planets significantly, not terribly, but significantly. And you see them saying, well, the old ones did this, but the moderns do that. So you see the shift occurring sometime around the 8th century, 9th century, somewhere around there. You see this shift. The dignity remained the same. The use remains the same. They have the same role and function in the system, but the way is shifting from one to the other. And this is interesting. And it changes a lot of how you interpret the text, but it's something that is very subtle within the text, and no one really catched it.
Sure. Or even, I mean, Ptolemy was only assigning 1 point to each dignity, so there's changes. I mean, Pingree said that every time astrology was transmitted to a new language or new culture, that it changed in some way. And it seems like the study of those changes from transmission to transmission is the main thing that all of us are focused on so much now, just in reconstructing what the history of astrology actually was.
Yeah.
Yes.
And sometimes the problem is the blanks. And for example, with Ptolemy is problematic, as you well know, because he's half transmitting things. So he doesn't make a good picture of astrological practice in his time. So sometimes we think, well, Ptolemy is doing this or he's doing that, and we really don't know what he's doing, because we have others to compare, and they're not doing anything of what he's doing. So it's a complicated author, and it's such an influential author through the whole history of astrology and the development of astrology throughout the millennia. So 2 millennia, really. But so it's complicated, and it has to be. Everything has to be weighed properly. For example, I have this opinion, which techniques, you can see certain techniques developing through time and accompanying the history of astrology until its end around the 17th century, where everything more or less collapses. If we can say this, it's right. But there's a tradition that falls there. There are other techniques which simply disappear from the map.
Right.
What happened there? For example, I'm thinking of the Hellenistic use of the parts, the lots. So there's things that are lost there. Why are they lost? Are they lost because they're not used so much? So we don't have the complete picture. So this is a very specific technique that probably the majority doesn't use. Do we lose them because there's some kind of cultural shift, some destruction in information due to a war or an event that makes us lose that information which was common at a given point? Or does it simply doesn't accompany the technological development of the art, of the knowledge? So we really need to see these things because, for example, some certain things of Hellenistic tradition you can still see hinted in the Arabic authors a lot and throughout the medieval period. They're not as explicit as you would find in an Hellenistic source, but the idea is still there, traveling along.
Right.
It gets more tenuous as you go along, but it's still there. So, and it's this history and this understanding that we have. How do the knowledge travel? How do the concepts travel? How do they flow? Do they really fall out of importance, or we simply don't have a full picture of the practice?
Yeah, sect is a big one that I have questions about, where it's so prominent in the Hellenistic tradition, and then it's maybe moderate or less so in the medieval tradition, and then it seems to completely disappear by the Renaissance.
Yes. Yes.
Which is strange because sect has to do with day and night.
It doesn't disappear. I was thinking, it doesn't disappear so much, and it's always mentioned. If I'm working on this now on manuals of astrology from the 17th century, and it's there. The concept is plainly explained there, as Ptolemy explains it in the Tetrabiblos, and you see the concept there. But you don't see so much the practical use. And here, I don't know if this is because we're looking at the manual, which only has the theory. Are we missing the practical side? Perhaps if we see enough practical examples, we might see it pop up more than we would expect. So this is a problem. One of those questions, the interesting questions. How does it change? Does it really change? Or does it change in the mainstream manuals? Or do people still practice it? What's happening here? How is this developing through time? And that's, for sect is an important point, for example. It's in one of the bases. It's a core concept of the doctrine, which is important to see. Yeah. So these are all things to explore. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hugely important for me coming from the Hellenistic perspective, but it's just interesting because there is sometimes in the revival of traditional astrology become different camps, like as you guys know, with like Renaissance versus medieval versus Hellenistic, and sometimes the disparity between them leads to differences in practice. So sect is one of those things where Renaissance astrologers today that follow sources like Lilly don't tend to either use or emphasize it, whereas Hellenistic astrologers do, and contemporary medieval astrologers integrate it somewhat moderately. So it's interesting seeing modern contemporary astrologers imitating the sources that they're drawing on in some ways through the ways that they're being influenced textually.
Yeah, it's true. And because there it is, because we do not have a complete line of tradition, so we had a break here. So we lost a bit of the line. We are reconstructing really a tradition at this point. So it really depends on where you're drawing your information. For example, you have William Lilly was for a long time the first major source for the practice. So you had that pop up in Orrery, Regiomontanus, and you see that influence popping up. As new translations came available, and you see the shift coming up again. Now you're seeing a great deal of Arabic texts coming into translation and being available. So you're going to see new level of information coming in. And at one point, I think we would have enough sources available in modern languages and enough people working properly on them to rebuild I wouldn't say we would rebuild tradition, if that is even possible, but at least to create a better view of what astrological tradition is. And this is one of the points why we usually say that we are traditional astrologers. We wouldn't say that we are either medieval or Renaissance or Hellenistic, because although I must say that we focus very much on medieval practices and we draw much of our practice in there, we're not ignoring everything else. We're looking at the whole picture. So there's adjustments there as we come along. So
and actually, that's what we want to do. It's not to focus on one aspect of one period. It's to understand how the tradition lives and develops and grows and all those sorts of things. And understanding this as almost like a living creature. This knowledge, this corpus of knowledge that is astrology. And that has accompanied us from the beginning, almost like a living creature that goes throughout all these different periods and gains different colors from different periods, gains new shades, new shapes also.
Exactly. I understand why does it gain new shapes again.
Yeah, why does it change?
Was it lost? Did it become useless? Was it a shift in mentality? What's happening there? And we need to see that although we did lose things and things get lost in the process of history, probably there are some other aspects of astrology which were dropped by a question of, let's, at the lack of a better word, a technological evolution within astrology itself. And certain things which were simplified were transformed into more complex calculations or different approaches due to more astronomical points of view. I don't know. I'm just not. I don't can't give you a specific example of this, but
they would value different things.
Yeah. So things change.
So also, there's not because sometimes people ask, but which one is the true tradition? Which one is the real astrology? Which one is the best? Is it Hellenistic? Is it medieval? Is it Renaissance? And well, it's like any other kind of knowledge or science, if you want to use the word, any other kind of knowledge. It just grows. It's alive.
It debates itself.
It questions itself. Yes,
there's always an inner debate on things, and that's healthy.
There's not one true good astrology. There's a system, and if you understand the system, you can have a critical view on ideas, on astrological ideas, and you can understand this is okay, this is coherent with the system, this is part of the system, and this is not. And most of the things, I wouldn't say everything, but most of the things in contemporary astrology are not really coherent with the system. So that's fine. If people want to practice this, that is fine. That's not our thing. But what we would like to understand is how this knowledge that expands for centuries lives and breathes and develops, not to find out which one is the best, which period is the best, but to understand all of these periods.
And really to understand, and that's a point of view that we've been finding out, is they all orbit one central corpus, which maintains more or less stable throughout.
It's very strong.
Its history. Yeah. And then there are major divergences there, here and there, and topics that can pop up into discussion, go again, disappear. But the idea, the core is always there. And
exactly. We always say it has a very strong core and a very flexible external boundary. So it's a bit like very hardcore, if you want, and then very flexible in the boundaries, and this external layer changes
according to time, cultures, regions, etc. So you see the shift in these discussions.
It's almost like a face, and you can put different makeups, different kinds of makeup.
It's always the same.
But it's always the same face.
Sure.
Beneath.
I like that. That is
So
another
it's
good
like-
analogy. You seem to have a way with analogies that I really like.
Well, I like analogies.
I meant to ask, are
Sometimes
you
I
going to
think-
publish your PhD dissertation now that it's finished?
Eventually, yes. What I had, and again, I'm a lucky person, because as soon as my PhD finished, there was this scholar, you probably know him, Jean-Patrice Baudet, in France. He writes about medieval astrology also. And he sent me an email and said, send me the PhD. I want to read it. And I was like, oh my God, what he's going to say. And he sent it back to me with a few questions, not about astrology itself, but about a few questions about manuscript and sources. Historical context, just a few things. And then David Just, which I know personally, said, send the PhD to me, please. And I was like, again, oh my God. And then I sent it to him. He lives in Sydney, Australia. And he shares his time between Sydney and Germany, basically, because of his academic projects. And he said, I'm going to print it, and I'm going to go to the seaside with my red pencil, and I will correct it. And I was terrified. And then it took him several weeks. And I was like, every day, and I thought, like,
Right.
oh, this... It's probably horrible because he's going on and on and on and correcting everything with his red pencil. But then he sent to me also a few corrections, not about astrology again, but about historical details. And I emailed him and said, oh my God, thank you, David, because I was terrified. I thought you were correcting everything was wrong. And he said, no, it's okay. So all this to tell you that I had to wait for this, and then I incorporated these corrections and
do some more translation to complete the text edition.
Yes, a few other things, and then I sent it again to Charles Burnett. So now it's back to me again, and it will be.
It's being revised so it can fit a book format, because there's a big difference between a PhD format and a book format. So we hope that it will be published at some point. But it's on preparation.
I just wanted you to understand that this was kind of a process.
Right, and that's after doing it for many years and then defending it and everything else. So you're still going through a long process afterwards.
Yes.
And Luís, you're in the process of finishing your PhD dissertation now?
Yes, I'm writing. My PhD has at this point 4 parts, I would say. I hope, I'm not sure. It's still an ongoing process. At some point I might decide otherwise, and 2 of them are finished, which are the core part of the analysis, and I hope now to do the introduction and a 4th segment. And it's coming along fine. The problem when you're working on this kind of study is that you're swimming in a sea of information, which it's not only your sources and the information that you're drawing from your sources, which sometimes is too much, and the sources of studies that have been made around the topic, and sometimes it's difficult. It's a difficult process to keep up and not to miss a key document or a key paper that might elucidate or might clarify or might discuss some certain aspect that you're trying to understand. So I'm still in this process, but I hope within a year to have everything finished. And then I hope to publish it as well.
And what's the focus, or what's the title? Or you don't have a title, but what's the focus?
The title, I never recall the title correctly, but it's something like Transgressing Boundaries. It has to do. I hadn't discussed this yet, but it's not a secret. I'm studying the teaching of astrology here in Portugal within the Jesuit context, because at the passage of the 16th and the 17th century, we have teaching of astrology in Portugal by Jesuit priests, by the college, which had this special class on mathematics, which included basic mathematics, astronomy, navigation, all the major topics of mathematics at that period, when included astrology. And so far, astrology had been thought out within this context, especially because we're talking about Jesuits and the religious context, and with all the prohibitions coming from the church 2 decades earlier, we think, well, this might be an oddity of some sort. And what I've been able to prove so far is that it's not an oddity. Astrology is there as part of the major program of mathematics in that school. And this is not a university, this is a pre-universitary knowledge. So we're talking about sort of a secondary, an equivalent to today's secondary.
Like in high school?
High school, kind of a high school level teaching, more or less. It's not exactly the same because the ages are a bit different, but the idea is that. So I'm studying how they teach it, how they transmit it, and how this pop up in a religious context, because we're talking about the Jesuits, which are supposed to be orthodox and reject completely these kinds of things. And that's one of the interesting aspects of history, is that you find that things are never so black and white, and there's a lot of discussion surrounding this. So you have these people which are church-obeying priests, clerics, trained in theology, trained in also in mathematics and natural philosophy, and they're teaching astrology, but they're teaching it in a religious context and proceeding with the religious strictures that are in place. And this is the debate I'm doing, is how they teach astrology then. What are the limits? How are they doing? And this is the ongoing process of research, and it's quite interesting. And it does have been allowing me to understand how do a lot of these shifts that we were discussing early in Renaissance astrology, from the medieval to the Renaissance, come about with all these discussions, because it's just the church prohibiting things regarding free will. It's a whole internal discussion on astrology that is coming from the past, coming from the period Helena studied, and she's already detected that in her PhD, and then you see it going around, and you're seeing it in the teaching form, which is rare. As I said, it's very rare that we have an astrology program and we have the syllabus. And here we were lucky enough that the manuscripts containing the complete course have survived.
Wow.
So I'm doing that, and probably if I'm mad enough in the future, I might translate at least one of them to English, because all of this is in Portuguese. Okay. But the PhD is in English, so it will have a lot of it translated. But I might consider translating one of these manuals, because I think it would be an excellent source for people studying this period to see what are they teaching in terms of basic
kind
astrology.
Of a late period in
it's very late period.
It's very interesting.
It might not be so interesting if you're
years.
looking. It is interesting always, but might not be interesting if you're looking at technical practices or comparing it with the richness of medieval or Hellenistic astrology. But it's still interesting to see how astrology shifts in terms of teaching at this period, with all the conversions of religious prohibitions and also astrologers changing astrology, which is something you can really see.
And in the middle of these prohibitions, it still survives.
It still survives. It's still there being practiced, and you can see the discussion going on. You think, the church and the Pope emitted a bull and astrology was forbidden. No, it wasn't. There was a discussion. You can't do this. How then we're going to practice medicine? And you see the discussion and the impact of these things, and it responding back. And it's very interesting. It's a very interesting process, and I hope to transmit at least a part of it with this research work.
So you're doing a dual thing then, in that you're studying how astrology was taught traditionally in the past, but then also you guys are gearing up to, it seems like, launch a new phase of teaching astrology to astrologers in contemporary times, right?
Well, we hope so. Mm-hmm. Even we would love to have people who are contemporary astrologers and intend to go on being contemporary astrologers, but we'd love to have them. Well, it happens already in Lisbon, to have them teaching the tradition, like suspending their thoughts for some time and teaching and learning the tradition, and then going back to whatever they like to do, contemporary or other kind, and but with the knowledge of the tradition, with this solid,
with the ground, with
grounded
the basis,
basis, yes,
a good ground base, so people can then build their ideas and their thoughts. Because I think most of contemporary astrology at this point has more to do with your belief system than really on the technique you're using.
Yeah.
There's a general technique which we could define, which is not traditional, but it's the modern technique. And then you have your belief system, your philosophy of life coming into and interpreting that for the client or whatever use you give to astrology. But that's okay. That's a way of approaching it. And then there's always been the personal belief or the personal philosophy coming into to practice in astrology on all periods. But we need to assure that astrology is there. Yeah, and the problem is that most of the time astrology gets lost in our own belief system and it goes out the window when people don't know what they're doing anymore. And I think that's the best contribution that can be given right now, is to have this is astrology, this is the core basis, this is a knowledge, this is I don't want to call it a science, because our concept of science nowadays is different, because it's not a science in the strict word of today's correspondence, but it is a body of knowledge with a certain method, with a certain core concepts that need to be preserved. And I think this is the most important part. Then you might explore it differently, you might put it to different uses, but you need to have this ground core very well defined enough so that it regains this kind of solidity that we see throughout history. And I think that's the major work to be done today for today's practitioners and today's people.
And then people can do whatever they want, knowing that this is astrology and this is something astrologically inspired, not necessarily astrology. This is one of the things, but it would be very good for everybody at least to have a basic knowledge of the tradition. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, the other consequence, and we talk about this a lot, is also that people who know only contemporary astrology, I think sometimes they feel, or some of them at least, they feel there's something missing. And so there is this kind of consumerism. Every time there's a new idea, a new technique, a new book, they want to get it, because there's something missing. Mm-hmm. And even if they don't admit it, and sometimes, most people understand.
We've all been there in certain ways.
We've all been there, yes, exactly. There's something that is, how do we put this together? And then there's a new book or a new technique or
a new asteroid or a new something, asteroid. A new calculation that might have
a new asteroid. Right. It's the even if it's small like a peanut, but it will be the one that solves the problem. So if you know the tradition, you don't have this kind of hunger for novelty.
Right.
And you just
hunger or like a thirst. That's a great keyword for that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then you can look at things. We also love the asteroids. We love everything that's new and it's out there. It is okay. We just don't need to put everything in the chart. We look at this astronomically, and it's fascinating. And we don't need to force everything to be astrological. It's different, and but it is fine. So when people learn the tradition, they are not as much.
They are more
bulimic with new things, if you want.
Yeah, they're more in tune with understanding and being able to apply it and being able to perfect the practice rather than to gain new knowledge. Knowledge can be gained to practice. How can I apply this correctly? At what extent can I stretch a certain definition or a certain...
Sure, there's not as much of a feeling that there's something missing or that there's a hunger to find the missing piece that will make your system work, but instead you already have a relatively strong foundation, and it's just a matter of applying that consistently and learning more and more as you go and continue to apply it in practice through your empirical studies.
Gaining expertise in a certain way. That's the key point. It's becoming an expert on a different on a specific
Because
approach.
there's one thing in our culture, contemporary culture, is the new thing is the good thing.
Right.
What is new is good. So if someone invents something new, like a new aspect or whatever, or discovers a new planet or something, the new thing is the good thing.
Yeah.
It's the good that is going to solve all the problems.
And sometimes the new thing is not even astrological. And I think people sometimes don't think about this. And there is all this input of information coming in, and that happened. We're a bit. I must say we have been a bit off the contemporary today's discussion of astrology, because we've been off conferences and lecturing and all of that for quite some time. But what I remembered is that people were adding these things, and sometimes they're adding things to astrology which are not astrological.
Yeah.
And we need to be very careful with that. Is that astrology, or is that something else that we're adding in because we're missing something, or because we liked something? And that's something that needs to be thought. And because there are things which are not astrological at all. They're not astrology. They're something else, or astrologically based, but they're not astrology. And we need to be a bit more strict with that. I don't mean to be fundamentalist, but we need to keep if we want a solid core of practice and a solid definition of a body of knowledge, we need to get some boundarings of what it is and what it is not. And that's an important work to do in the next the next generations. Yeah.
Because if people want to do something non-astrological, that's fine. That is fine. Just don't call it astrology, because it's not. And also, apart from this search for the new thing, it's also the problem, the temptation, I would say, of syncretism. Everything has to do with everything. We know that. We all know that forever. But it doesn't mean that you put everything in the horoscope. And just because I always say this as a joke, there are 7 planets, visible planets, and counting with the sun and the moon, and 7 planets, 7 chakras, 7 musical notes, 7 dwarfs, Snow White. And so we don't put a dwarf in every chakra because it doesn't make sense. We don't need to put everything into astrology.
Not everything is an equivalence, and we have to be careful about that.
Although everything has to do with everything, we don't have to deal with everything every time,
If there's one quote that survives the centuries from now, I hope it's that quote that you don't have to put a dwarf in every chakra.
Which might be very cryptic if said over the sun. All references to the tale disappear out of.
There's going to be a debate about that.
I will be known for this.
Right, there'll be a whole academic conferences with people writing papers to interpret what you meant by that.
Exactly.
Arguing about the correct interpretation. Well, I think
but
you guys have been.
What I mean.
Yeah, but you guys have been gone for a while, and I think now that you're coming back, and if you start, because I know you've both been intensely focused on your academic work for much of the past decade and focused on your PhDs, but the community has changed rapidly, and traditional astrology has taken off way faster than I think anybody expected over the past decade. But part of the reason for that was, and you guys affected that, was due to your book, and your book may have had a greater impact over the past decade than you realize in helping to spur the traditional revival and act as one of the first books that allowed people to make that their entryway into astrology rather than having to go through modern or contemporary astrology first. So there was something I said recently, a quote that I came up with on Twitter, which is just, it seems like one of the main things that people are feeling is with the traditional revival lately is that which is old is new again, and that which is new suddenly seems old and outdated. And that's almost like the mindset that a lot of people have adopted over the past decade as part of this traditional revival. So it's exciting that you now are launching the next phase of that, which is this new book, and you're also launching a course soon to go with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and it will be managed by Maria Mateus.
Yeah, she'll be participating.
She will be part of this.
Well, only problem right now is time. academic work, unfortunately, is very time consuming. So as soon as we have the system all set up, we'll be launching, I hope, by November. I'll have that ready, but we'll have to work it out. But we will announce it soon enough. So
Okay, brilliant. And your two books will be required reading for the course, and people can find both of those on Amazon.com, and that's the primary way to order the books, right?
Yeah, right now it is. Yes.
We tried other methods, but this is the more practical.
It reaches people more. It's
Yeah.
easier.
Will you be republishing the first book at some point? Because the one thing I love about the new book is you self-published it, and just the layout and the design is really beautiful. And it's like a hugely, not improvement to insult the first book, but just your design skills. Because I know you, Luís, you're a professional designer. You do graphic design.
I did a lot of professional design. The diagrams in the book are my authorship. This cover, I must say, is from our editor, because we have our editor that does this design, and he reconstructed the way the book looks. I'm not sure if I have
it's there.
Yeah, it's here. The Portuguese book, it's more or less within the same design level, so it works.
So it's blue, and the other one
and
is
the one's
white.
So it goes with the same design. It has the same structure, and he reconstructed it wonderfully from the earlier edition in Portuguese. The English edition is now managed by the AFA, so it's up to them to change design or structure of the book, and I'm not sure if they're going to do that or not. There are some updates to the book that should have been done at some point, because knowledge evolves, and we have adjusted a couple of things. The Portuguese edition already has it, but that is a matter of publishing rights, and you know how those things work and can be complicated. Sure. But I don't know. Who knows?
We would love to have the two books with this look. The one in blue and another one in white.
Exactly. Right now we're going to do the next books that will come out probably from us will be more academically oriented, of course, on the history of astrology, and would be the output of our current research. We have other books also planned on more history of astrology, so there are at least possibly 3 books on the way in the next 3 years. Helena's PhD, another book that we're preparing, and my PhD eventually probably will publish that. At least I'll try to do that. That has to be finished first. And who knows if we're going to do some kind of continuation to the On the Heavenly Spheres. It's possible. Part of Volume 2 has been written for some years now, which is the book that teaches how to delineate each house and go into the interpretation of the chart. But it has a lot of work yet still to be done, and the predictive techniques, which is also a major part of astrology, which still needs to be properly taught and go in when that's to be revised. I think we're too spread out now. We have a couple of works already starting to come up with a concise approach to prediction, but that's a work that we would like to do in the future. But who knows? It's still ideas and projects.
But the book, the second part of this book would be, I don't know, it would take some time, because we don't want just to show the techniques like, oh, these are the techniques and that's it. We want to really take the student by the hand and say, what we do is this, and in case of doubt, in this case we do this and we do that, and
there's exceptions. There's an exception A, exception B, exception C. Why do they occur? How do you handle them?
And
it takes time to write these things.
We don't like to give only one example, because if you give one example, it's exactly the one that is not useful for the student. So we want to give at least 2 or 3 examples for each thing, and we write the book as the book that we wanted to have had when we were studying. So it really takes time.
So that you have an idea, I think one of the chapters that is already written, which is on resources, money, resources, substance, all that kind of work, is, if I'm not mistaken, around 12 example charts, each one for highlighting a given aspect of the delineation. So we're this complicated when explaining and writing books. So
Sure.
it takes time.
There's a lot going on. But right now you just have sort of like an under construction page, but you'll be relaunching your website soon. And what is the URL, or what is the address where people can sign up or can find out more information about you?
So is Academia de Astrologia. I know it's a Portuguese, but you probably can place a link that will have the Portuguese and the English version. We don't have no longer the access to the English link that we had a couple of years ago, but we'll have probably with the new website when it's ready, it will immediately shift into Portuguese and English according to the region and the language that you're using in the browser. So we hope that will make things easier for people to access it.
Brilliant. Well, I'll put a link to the website on the description page for this episode, or below the YouTube video in the description if people are watching this on YouTube. But yeah, thanks a lot for joining me today. Is there anything we should have covered or mentioned that we didn't get a chance to? I'm trying to think. We covered a lot here.
I think so.
I think we had the basics.
Yeah.
We can't speak for hours, but you don't want that.
Yeah.
There's a limit.
There's a limit for your patience.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me today, and congratulations on the launch of this new book, and thanks for writing the first one and the impact that you've had on the tradition so far.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your feedback. It's really important for us. We had no idea. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And hopefully people can leave some comments in the comment section for this episode, just to express if they had read your book or where they found it in their studies and what sort of impact it's had on them. Because I think there's a fair amount of people that it has had an impact on. So maybe we'll get a sense for that with the release of this episode. All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me today. And thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast. And we'll see you next time. Thanks to our patrons who helped to support the production of this episode through our page on patreon.com. In particular, I'd like to give a shout out to our patrons Christine Stone and Nate Craddock, as well as the AstroGold Astrology app, available at astrogold.io, and the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org.